It's the spring of 865. We're in the north of England, and the King of Northumbria, a man named Aella, finds himself in the midst of a dilemma. Aella has possession of a man named Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most famous Vikings of the era. Ragnar had been captured after a catastrophically botched raid on Northumbria, and now his fate rests in the hands of King Aella. But what to do with this terrifying figure? On the one hand, he's far too dangerous to be set free. On the other, doing harm to this legendary Viking would most certainly come with consequences. After some consideration, King Aella figures that his best move is to bump Ragnar off, but to make sure it's done in such a terrifying manner that no Viking will dare to approach Northumbria again. A series of events are now set in motion, which will result in the Blood Eagle, perhaps the most terrifying death that anybody could imagine, in which a victim's ribcage is opened from behind before the lungs are pulled out and draped over the exposed ribs, creating the impression of a set of bloody wings, flapping with each shallow breath which inflates the lungs, all while the victim is still alive. But it won't be Ragnar Lothbrok who receives this punishment. For Ragnar, death comes in a slightly different flavour, and he's tossed into a pit of venomous snakes, where he's bitten and strangled by the violent serpents that now surround him. As one set of venomous fangs after another sinks into Ragnar's flesh, and his arms and legs are restrained by the wriggling snakes, this hardy Viking finds the strength to lift his head out of the hole and spit a prophecy at King Aella. How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. Rather than getting a taste of justice, Aella and his advisors are left with something else in their mouths: regret and fear. It doesn't take long for the news of Ragnar Lothbrok's punishment to make waves across the Viking world, eventually reaching Ragnar's 4 sons, Ivan the Boneless, Ubbe, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Hvitserk. They heard the details of Ragnar's fate, torn apart by snakes, injected with spiteful venom, and strangled on the armless frames of the serpents. The old boar had certainly suffered, and now the little piggies were grunting. 4 little piggies, to be exact, who went on to swear a blood oath to avenge their father's death. By autumn of that same year, 865, the boys arrive in East Anglia at the head of an enormous Viking force known today as the Great Heathen Army. One particular brother, Ivar the Boneless, tells his brothers to keep things secure down south. He's going to go up to Northumbria alone and speak to the king man to man. When Ivar and Aella met, the Viking son of Ragnar is amicable, understanding even. He accepts that Aella was put in an impossible position, that his father probably had it coming, and that there was no ill will between them. As a favour, he asks Aella if he could be granted a plot of land as recompense for the loss of his father. Aella is in no real position to say no, and the two men agree that Ivar would be guaranteed a plot of land, equal in size to the hide of an ox. But Ivar is feeling cheeky and pushes his luck by cutting the ox hide into long strips, which he uses to draw a large circle on the ground, room enough to build an entire fortress. Aella reluctantly approves, and without meaning to, he's given the Vikings a foothold in the north, and Ivar a position from which to build influence and strength in the region. A year later, Ivar is confident that he's got enough ducks in a row and enough lay of the land that he can throw his weight around, and so he calls his brothers to join him. By 866, the brothers arrived with their army and captured the city of York. King Aella's chickens are coming home to roost. Now he has the unenviable position of trying to recapture his own city from a horde of monsters and heathens, all crying for the blood of the man who tossed Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of snakes. It takes Aella a year to get his forces in order, and in 867 he desperately throws his army at the Vikings in York, trying as hard as he might to drive out these invaders and restore peace to the realm. The Northumbrian king is woefully unsuccessful. His armies are crushed, routed, and scattered to the hills. Left all alone, Aella is captured alive, and the 4 sons of Ragnar Lothbrok have full license to select when and how their father's killer should face justice. Perhaps it'd be best to starve him, perhaps burn him alive. Some little piggies were grunting that Aella should suffer the same fate that the old boar did, and have him tossed into a pit of snakes. But then Ivar the Boneless comes forward and suggests the worst fate of them all: the Blood Eagle. It's a controversial suggestion. According to the legends, the punishment is reserved especially for Vikings, the story going that should someone be able to endure the process without screaming in agony, then they will still have their place in Valhalla, even if their crimes might have otherwise denied them access to the Great Hall. Despite the hang-ups though, it seems to have been a hit with the others, and with that, King Aella's fate was sealed. The process began by dragging the broken king out of captivity and placing him on his site of execution, usually a slab of unyielding stone. Once there, he would be restrained, either by being forced to lay down and having his hands and legs tied together, or instead on his knees, with his arms outstretched, tied to 2 posts either side of him. Once properly restrained, King Aella would have felt a sharp, searing, digging sensation as a dagger was slowly used to bore a hole into the small of his back, just to the side of the spinal cord. This alone would have caused unimaginable pain due to the high concentration of nerves in the area, but it was really just the beginning of the torment. After the dagger had been driven home, a violent upward shove would be next, driving the blade further and further up the spine towards the base of the neck. Given the rather sinewy nature of this part of the body, this would not have been a smooth slice upwards, but instead a series of violent, bloody tugs, not unlike the pulling of an uncooperative zip on a broken backpack. Just that this time, it's a human being unzipped from behind. Although King Aella was a Christian, not a Viking, he was still said to have endured the process in resolute silence, not allowing a single whisper of agony or complaint to escape his lips. Perhaps he saw himself more of a martyr than an honourable warrior bound for Valhalla. Nonetheless, his steadfastness impressed the brothers. But still, nothing could prepare him, or anyone else, for what came next. Once a line had been carved from the small of his back to the base of his neck, those performing this execution, often said to be Ivar's brothers themselves, would then follow the wound with their hands, plunging fingers into the open cut and tugging away at the skin and flesh, opening the line along his back like a pair of curtains. Needless to say, this would have been unthinkably painful, as nerve endings attached to the spine and central nervous system are systematically torn away from their housing. But it served another function, as the process would have exposed the spine, allowing for the next stage of the Blood Eagle. With the skeletal structure under the flesh exposed, an axe, or a hammer and chisel, would be taken to the base of the spine, where it would begin slowly bashing away at the bone, taking chunks, one swing at a time. But they wouldn't be aiming for the spine itself. Instead, they would be targeting the ribs either side, so that they were removed from the spinal cord themselves and left to float inside the torso. There are 24 individual ribs attached to the thoracic vertebrae, each of which would need to be carefully removed, one at a time. Although this would require immense precision so as not to damage the spine itself or the organs underneath, it was still ultimately a violent process, and being so close to the spine would have been incredibly painful. After all 24 ribs had been smashed, broken, and severed from the spine, the last stages of the process could finally begin. The now free ribs would be taken by the hand and ripped outwards like opening a cupboard. Again, this would need to be done more or less one at a time, causing the front of the ribs to fold into the chest cavity, whilst the back of the ribs rose out in a grotesque frame, not unlike the outline of a pair of wings attached to the back. At this stage, King Aella was seasoned, as one of the brothers spitefully threw a handful of salt into his back to add more suffering into the mix. Although it must be said that this tidbit is only mentioned in one of the sources, so like King Aella, feel free to take that detail with a pinch of salt. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Anyway, now that the back had been exposed, the rib bones disconnected from the spine, and the rib cage itself drawn out of the back and into the shape of a pair of wings, the final stage was imminent, which was to reach into the chest cavity, carefully grip the lungs, and then drape them over the ribs in order to finish the wings. As King Aella drew his final breaths, the lungs would have expanded, creating a display not unlike a pair of bloody wings, flapping in the wind as the victim underneath was left to expire. Aella's death marked the beginning of Norse dominance in northern England, and he became the most famous blood eagle execution in legend, and it turned him into a mythic villain whose name survives in poetry, sagas and screen. A Christian king torn open as tribute to the old gods. But did it actually happen? Well, fortunately, probably not. Most of the sources we have for this particular telling of the story are a bit wishy-washy on detail, and they blur the line between history and literature. King Aella was most likely just executed in a normal fashion. But I know you guys will find that disappointing. God knows why. So let's focus on the Blood Eagle again, because he's not the only example of it happening, and ask the question, did the Blood Eagle itself ever actually happen, even if not to King Aella? Well, there are a few sources across the Viking sagas and a few Anglo-Saxon texts that mention the Blood Eagle. The most literal description is in the Ragnar which is the life of Ragnar's sons, in which they go through the tearing of the ribs and the hanging of the lungs. And then again, in the Orkneyinga saga, there's a mention of a blood eagle being performed on a guy named Halfdan Longleg. And then lastly, Saxo Grammaticus, an Anglo-Saxon chronicler who talks a bit about the Vikings doing this kind of stuff. Historians argue back and forth constantly about whether this is just a literary motif, perhaps an attempt by Christians to demonize the Vikings, or if it did actually happen and that's why it's in the sources. Although it should be said that all of these sources are writing at least 100 years after the Blood Eagle was supposed to have happened. There's also no archaeological evidence to prove the Blood Eagle ever happened, but I don't think that that's a particularly damning consideration, because this was a sacrificial execution, so the victim was unlikely to be buried and may have even been burned afterwards. So the jury really is out, at least on the historicity of it all. So the next question I had, which I'm sure you also have, is would something like the Blood Eagle even be possible? Because if we've learned anything so far on this channel, it's that if something horrible and cruel can be done, it often has been done. So, is the Blood Eagle actually possible? And the depressing answer is yes, it's definitely possible, but there's a few caveats. If you were going to do this to someone and wanted them to stay alive for the final crescendo of breathing lungs being drawn over exposed ribs, you're going to have three big problems to deal with. The first one is the scapula, or shoulder blades. These would get right in the way of the upper ribs and make drawing them or cutting them impossible. So in order to get to the ribs themselves, the shoulder blades would also need to go. But it's not that easy. There's a lot of blood vessels around these triangular bones and plenty of sinew and tendon. So you'd be there for quite a while, digging around to try and free these. Quite a long time that your victim might not have, because you've got another problem to deal with: blood loss, and not just from the shoulder blades. Even once you get rid of those, you need to then hack the ribs off the spine. But each rib is supplied by posterior intercostal arteries, and these branch off from the thoracic aorta, which means if you break them open, especially all 24 of them, you're going to die fast. They also run along the underside of each rib in what's called the costal groove, where they supply blood to the ribs, intercostal muscles, and overlaying skin. In other words, you can't just leave them. If you want to get rid of those ribs, you also need to tear these arteries. So if you wanted the victim to survive, you would have to cut, then cauterize the nub of the rib, still attached to the spine, a process not mentioned in the sources and obviously very risky. And then lastly, you've got the biggest problem to deal with, a pneumothorax. See, the lungs need negative pressure to function, but once you open the chest cavity from behind, this negative pressure immediately disappears, causing the lungs themselves to instantly collapse like wet cloth. This would make breathing impossible, which means the victim has got minutes before death would come, and you've still got 24 ribs to saw through. Now, assuming you were expecting the victim to die before the process was completed, you could still technically do all of these steps to get the final result. But instead of having an impressive display of breath-filled lungs draped over the ribs like a pair of wings, you'd actually get something a bit more ridiculous as the lungs deflate into fist-sized nubs of organ, which you would have to kind of skewer on one of the ribs, with the victim underneath long gone. Nonetheless though, this would still be a horrific, slow and painful way to meet your maker, and would still perform very well as a symbolic method of execution, just not quite what we imagine when we hear about the Blood Eagle. So, did it actually happen? Maybe. It's the 5th of April 1532. We're in Smithfield, London, where a bustling crowd has gathered around a large bronze pot filled with bubbling water. As more and more curious souls join the crowd, a man, Richard Roos, is marched to the scaffold above the cauldron, restrained and under armed guard. During the 35-minute walk from the Tower of London to Smithfield, he's had plenty of time to ponder his fate, but nothing will properly prepare him for the agony ahead. But to many watching, it's well deserved. This is all sanctioned under the license of justice. After all, Richard Roos had been involved in a failed plot to poison a bishop named John Fisher, and although he was unsuccessful, 2 people died, and a dozen more were left critically ill. People were so upset about the whole affair that the King of England, Henry VIII, had even gone before Parliament to ensure that Mr. Roos felt the full weight of the law and make an example to any other would-be poisoners. Legislation would even be changed, retroactively making poisoning a formal act of treason, and the punishment for this transgression was to be put to death by being boiled alive. Richard Roos was to be the first example. Once he reached his execution site, he was stuffed into a gibbet, a kind of cage which was dangling over the boiling pot. Once securely within, he was offered a few words of comfort with a priest, and then slowly lowered into the scalding water. An eyewitness would record that as his legs were submerged by the hot liquid, he roared mighty loud, and women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. This was the first stage in an execution that would go on for nearly 2 hours, as the skin was slowly steamed off of his flesh, and the life gradually ebbed from Richard's body, with each dip back into the boiling pot. But how exactly did we get here? What's the story behind Richard Roos's murder plot? And more gruesomely, what details survive of Roos's execution? And what would it actually feel like to be boiled alive? Our story begins on the 18th of February 1531 with a bishop named John Fisher, who's hard at work in his study, and after hours of squinting and scribing by candlelight, he's tired. So tired, in fact, that he refuses to eat his dinner. He tells the cook, Roos, to distribute the food prepared to the poor, something called alms, which was a pretty routine thing for the wealthy to do, handing out whatever was left after dinner to those who were starving. In this case, it was a dish known as pottage, a sort of chunky meat and vegetable stew cooked in a large pot. hence the name, and then served communally for guests to enjoy. The decision to skip this delicious meal of pottage and to instead give it to the poor to enjoy is a choice that will go on to save John Fisher's life and condemn Richard Roos's. Shortly after consuming the food offered, those who ate felt unwell almost immediately. About a dozen were violently sick within an hour of eating. It didn't take long for people to start getting nervous, and then things escalated even further when a beggar named Alice Trippitt died from her meal of pottage, and then a member of Fisher's own house, Bernard Curwen, succumbed shortly after. Suspicion quickly fell on the caterers, and Fisher went to confront the head cook, Mr. Roos. However, upon entering the kitchen, he found that the cook had disappeared. It looked as though this renegade chef had decided to make a run for it. Hardly the act of an innocent man. The word was put out that John Fisher's cook was a poisoner, and he was currently on the run. By the next morning, the authorities had found him laying low on the other side of the City of London and had him promptly arrested before he was dragged into the Tower of London, where he would undergo some pretty harsh questioning. Although at first Roos refused to say much of anything, he would soon have his lips loosened after a stint on the rag, a torture device which works by tearing the arms and legs out of their sockets until they're dislocated completely. Under the duress of torture, however, Roos spilled the beans and admitted that he had added a white powder to the pottage before serving it to the Fisher household and the beggars who had come for alms. But he insisted that this wasn't supposed to be a fatal concoction, and instead he was told that it was a laxative. According to Roos, the whole affair was supposed to be nothing more than a harmless, although perhaps rather messy, prank. To make matters worse, Roos wasn't able to give his questioners any information in regards to where he got the white powder from or who gave it to him. He just said that he got the white powder from a nameless stranger. The story didn't really make much sense. Why would this professional cook decide to add an adulterant to his master's food just because a nameless stranger had said it would make for a ripping prank? Nonetheless, for the authorities, it was more or less case closed. They had their suspect in custody, captured after fleeing from the crime scene, and now they had a full confession. Richard Roos was their man, so much so that King Henry VIII personally stepped in to ensure that the case skipped trial altogether and moved straight ahead to the punishment. In fact, on the 28th of February, just 10 days after the whole affair, King Henry would even go to Parliament in person, where he said that on the 18th day of February 1531, one Richard Roos of Rochester, Cook, also called Richard Cook, did cast poison into a vessel, standing in the kitchen of the Bishop of Rochester's palace at Lambeth March, by means of which 2 persons who happened to eat the pottage made with such yeast died. Not only did the monarch and Parliament find Roos guilty without a full trial, they would even go on to have a new law passed, the Poisoning Act of 1530, which formally defined poisoning as an act of treason, the punishment for which should be, as we now know, being boiled alive. The act would specify that the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roos, for the said murder and poisoning of the said 2 persons, shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall be therefore boiled to death without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender deprived of his clergy and boiled to death. And so, for the crime of attempted poisoning on Fisher, Richard Roos's fate was sealed. And don't worry, we will cover this process in detail very shortly. But what if the story is actually far more complicated than we just covered? See, I mentioned earlier that Roos's confession didn't really make much sense. After all, why would anyone in the world take that much risk just to pull off a schoolyard prank when the consequences are so dire? And if Roos knowingly put poison into the household's food, you'd expect that he might have come up with a more convincing alibi, since there was a very high likelihood he would have been caught, even if he was successful. Either way you shake it, it looks like Mr. Roos might not have been as involved as the authorities would have us believe. Many historians believe that Roos was more likely an unknowing pawn in a much bigger game. If we zoom out of what we've currently covered on this kitchen drama, we'll see that there's some pretty powerful players stirring the pot. One powerful player in particular, named Henry VIII. See, it would turn out that Henry and John Fisher were actually locked into some pretty fierce religious beef, and for the monarch, this deadlock was becoming quite inconvenient. See, at the time, Henry wanted to divorce his current wife, Catherine, so that he could marry the apple of his eye, at least for the moment, Anne Boleyn. Henry had tried to recruit Fisher to tarnish Catherine's reputation. Fisher was incredibly intellectually influential and popular across the church, both in England and in Rome, so his voice would have been a powerful asset. Unfortunately, being a man of the church, Fisher saw the whole affair as a tremendous scandal, and instead of writing in the king's defence, he took up his quill to come to Catherine's aid, significantly hampering Henry's chances of ever getting that sanctioned divorce. This was the beginning of a number of lovers' spats between the two men, and when Fisher started challenging Henry's newly appointed religious powers, he more or less sealed his own fate, or so Henry would have liked. According to the 16th century chronicler Richard Hall, the culprit who actually put the poison into the food was most certainly not Roos, but instead, and this is a direct quote, a certain naughty person of a most damnable and wicked disposition. The explanation goes that someone orchestrated for Roos to leave the kitchen, and when he was absent, they poisoned the pot. When people started falling ill, Roos did the natural thing for someone who lived in an era when poisoners were put to death, and he got the hell out of Dodge. If this were true, it would also explain why Henry decided to have Roos condemned to death without taking the case to trial, since if Roos were given his day in court, uncomfortable truths may end up coming to light which could implicate Henry's involvement in the failed assassination of a political rival. Henry decided to have the cook dealt with quickly in order to cover his tracks. The best way to do this, without attracting attention to himself, was to lean into the wave of panic that the poisoning had set off across London, and feign that same level of shock and disgust that was currently all the rage. See, that's the thing about Henry VIII. Everyone remembers him for his big belly, his 6 wives, and his intemperate tantrums. But Henry was also an incredibly skilled political operator. He was, after all, able to orchestrate a complete split between England and Rome's religious institutions without sparking a civil war or being assassinated. He might seem like a ridiculous, pot-bellied tyrant to us today, but he certainly understood the machinery of power very intuitively. And so Henry decided to come down on Roos like a ton of bricks. Not because he was actually disgusted by the poisoning, after all he might have ordered it, and he probably knew Roos wasn't the culprit in any case. Instead, though, Henry was using this innocent cook to send a message. An ambassador to the English court at the time, named Eustace Chapois, wrote that this unusually cruel and painful punishment was put aside for Roos simply so that Henry could divert suspicion away from himself. To quote, "Many suspect that the deed was done by command of those who are troubled by his constancy and his defence of the Queen." In other words, it must have been the king or his immediate inner circle. Despite the scepticism, however, the execution would still go ahead, and so we find ourselves back at the beginning on the 5th of April 1532 with Richard Roos in a gibbet in Smithfield, dangling over a scalding pot of water, about to be boiled alive. This execution, as I said, would go on for nearly 2 hours, and to remind you, dear viewer, this was very likely an innocent man caught in a game of chess between church and state. Instead of being dunked in the water all at once, which would still be an absolutely excruciating death, he was submerged into the scalding water 3 separate times, each time being winched out of the pot to recover before being dropped under the surface for another stint. The first time, the executioners dipped him only to the waist. Almost immediately, his skin blistered and split, the outer dermis peeling away like soaked parchment. Nerve endings in the groin, thighs, and abdomen would have fired relentlessly, sending waves of searing pain to the brain. The water boiled not just the skin, but began cooking muscle tissue, contracting it in spasms as it denatured. His screams echoed through Smithfield. The second plunge brought the water up to his shoulders. At this point, the chest cavity was exposed. Roos's lungs likely inhaled superheated steam, scalding the trachea and bronchi from within. With each gasp, he drew in more pain. His lips and tongue may have blistered and swollen, deforming his cries into slurred, frantic gibberish. A chronicler, Edward Hall, wrote that he roared and cried and said diverse things in the boiling water. It seems he would have leapt out if he could. Then came the third and final plunge. Roos was fully submerged, silent by this point, his central nervous system likely having been overwhelmed. Whether unconscious or simply unable to scream, the silence was soon broken only by the bubbling of the cauldron. As his body stewed, a pink hue spread across the water, a blooming mix of blood, skin, and fat. Death would not have come quickly. Only after his core temperature surged past survivability, only after the heart fibrillated or the lungs collapsed, did he finally die. With Roos dead, in this unthinkably grotesque and very public way, Henry had got everything he wanted. He sent a clear message to any potential poisoner or lawbreaker, whilst also terrifying bishops like Fisher, who may have survived the poison plot, but were being shown firsthand what happens if you make an enemy of the king. As if to prove Henry guilty of the whole plot, just 4 years later, when his position against the church was far more secure, he came for John Fisher personally and had him locked in the Tower of London before finally beheading him. All in a day's work for one of England's most Machiavellian kings, a skilled political operator with a firm tyrannical streak. It's the 19th of December 1702. We're in the Bastille, an enormous prison complex in Paris, and in the absolute lowest bowels of this fortress of incarceration and torture stands a man who has spent the last 33 years rotting behind bars. Well, actually, it would be more accurate to say he has been rotting under bars, as he suffers one of the worst fates possible, the Oubliette. A pitch-black underground dungeon the victims are tossed into, left with nothing but darkness and scuffling rats for company, until they're completely forgotten to the world, and finally succumb to malnutrition or madness. And as for the man currently in the Oubliette, under the Bastille, nobody knows for certain how long he's been there, or why he's been imprisoned in the first place. Guards are under strict orders never to communicate with him, only breaking the silence to toss down flasks of fetid water or scraps of mouldy bread. So extreme is his seclusion within the dungeon that these guards don't even know his name or what he looks like. Most have never seen his face through the pitch-black cell. Those that have gotten close enough to actually make out his features are sworn to an oath of complete silence. To most of the guards, he's known simply as the Man in the Iron Mask. It's the only name we have for him that survives to this day, and although many have tried to uncover his true identity, no one is certain who this prisoner in the Oubliette is. The Oubliette itself comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. For the Man in the Iron Mask, it's most certainly been effective. No one can remember his true identity, and after 3 decades of wasting away in total darkness, neither can he. This was one of the very few confirmed cases of the Oubliette's use. You could argue that this was because it was an exceptionally rare punishment, but perhaps the real reason that records are so scarce is simply because of how effective the Oubliette was at making people utterly forgotten and forever erased from history. But what actually was the Oubliette, and who was the Man in the Iron Mask? In the medieval and early modern period, prison was not a go-to punishment like it is today. Instead, punishment was swift and public, with an emphasis on corporal punishments like flogging or capital punishments like hanging. This is partly because keeping a peasant behind bars and feeding them every day whilst they can no longer contribute to farming or labour would have been an outrageous expense at the time, but it was also because of some religious beliefs around crime and punishment in medieval Europe. Serious crimes like murder were believed to add a kind of moral pollution to the community, and so a public execution or punishment was seen as a way of cleansing the moral community of that corruption and restoring things to a state of harmony. So, when someone was actually put behind bars, it usually meant that they weren't just criminals, but were instead hostages from wealthy families or rival political factions, and they would be held in captivity while their captor used them as a bargaining chip for negotiations and settlements. For this purpose, most captives would be kept inside a castle dungeon, where they would wait until a settlement was agreed, at which point they would be let free to go on their way. But in some cases, far deeper within the complex was a very particular kind of dungeon called the Oubliette, where people could be locked away for far longer periods of time, often forever, and far away from the public eye. Unlike a normal prison cell, an oubliette was usually a narrow vertical shaft, sometimes barely wide enough to stand or sit in, with a single trapdoor at the top. No windows, no light, no comfort. Victims were lowered in through the trapdoor and left in total darkness. The only sounds were that of your own breath, the scurrying of rats, and the drip of water echoing off of cold stone walls. Oftentimes the oubliette was so tight that the victim would be forced to stand for the entirety of their time within, leaning on the slimy, moss-ridden face of the stone walls, or worse, against the remains of those who had come before, and were discarded in the hole to perish. Since the whole thing was at the very bottom of the castle's structure, waste from latrines and rotten groundwater would often pool at the base of the oubliette, leaving the victim knee-deep in stinking water, who would be unable to see what was underneath the surface since everything was pitch black. First, the darkness, not just nighttime dark, but a suffocating absolute black. The kind of dark where your eyes never adjust, where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Days and nights blur into each other, time stops existing. Then there's the cold. The oubliette was dug deep into the stone, damp, bitterly cold, the air stale and heavy. Your clothes, if you had any, would stay permanently wet. Your skin would blister, your joints would ache constantly, you'd never get dry or ever get warm. And worst of all, the silence, broken only by distant echoes, the sound of rats, or the occasional clang of the trapdoor far above. No voices, no sunlight, no human contact, just endless solitude. You wouldn't even know how long you'd been down there. Weeks, months, years. You'd lose track of everything. Speech, memory, your sense of self. And eventually, if starvation or thirst didn't kill you, your own mind would. Few people who went into an oubliette ever came out, and if they did, they rarely came out sane. There were many ways to die in a hole like this, but none of them were quick. Starvation was common. Some were thrown down with just enough food and water to prolong the suffering. Crusts of stale bread, filthy water dripped down from above. It kept them alive just long enough to make them wish that they weren't. Then there was exposure. These pits were deep stone shafts, always wet, and as we said, always cold. Hypothermia could take you slowly, especially in winter. Infections would fester in the filth, and you can imagine where you would need to go to the bathroom in this situation. Rats would gnaw at you while you slept, standing up, or while you were too weak to stop them chewing on you. But worst of all was the mind, the total silence, the complete darkness. It could break a person long before the body gave out. Locked away with nothing but your own thoughts, not knowing if it's a day or night, if it's been a week or a year, the brain starts to fracture. Hallucinations set in. Memory slips. You forget your name. You forget the world. Some prisoners reportedly began to speak to walls, to sing to themselves for hours, or simply to stop responding altogether. The Oubliette didn't need torturers. The Oubliette was the torture. We don't have diaries from victims, but we do know what happens to a human mind under similar conditions because modern psychologists have studied it by looking closely at solitary confinement, especially in supermax prisons, and the effects are disturbing. After just a few days in complete isolation, inmates report anxiety, paranoia, insomnia, hallucinations, even full-on psychotic breaks. And these are people who still get food, lighting, warmth, and maybe a toilet. Now, imagine what it's like in an oubliette. No light, no human voices, no clear sleep cycle, no stimulation, nothing. The brain needs stimulation to stay grounded in reality, and if you take that away, the mind starts creating its own. That's when the walls start to breathe. That's when you hear voices that aren't there. That's when you start to believe you're being watched or eaten alive from the inside. In short, the oubliette doesn't just punish the body, it strips away a person's sense of time, place, identity, and eventually, sanity. By the time starvation or infection finally sets in, the person who dies in the pit might no longer resemble the person who went in. And maybe that was the point all along. Not just to make someone disappear, but to unmake them completely. So, how often was this punishment actually used? Well, the oubliette is one of those punishments that barely leaves a trace, and that's the point. It was designed to make people vanish, quietly and completely. Because of that, we don't have long lists of names or detailed court records. Most who were thrown in were meant to be forgotten. That's what makes tracking real cases so difficult. You don't record what you're trying to erase. But the concept appears in whispers and rumours across Europe. In the Loire Valley, some castles have narrow stone shafts that match the exact design, hidden behind walls or beneath trapdoors, just wide enough to let someone in. In Scotland and Germany, some accounts described bottle dungeons, deep pits beneath towers where political enemies or traitors could be sealed away without trial. And then there's the one case that might prove the oubliette wasn't just a legend. The individual with whom we started this episode. The man in the Iron Mask. He was arrested in 1669 under a false name, and for the next 34 years he was shuffled between the most secure prisons in France. Pignerol, Exil, Saint-Maurice, and finally, the Bastille. His guards were given strict orders never to speak to him, never let him be seen, and above all, never reveal his identity. At all times, he was forced to wear a mask. Some said velvet or black, some claimed it was iron, hence the name, to keep his face hidden, even in death. He died in 1703 and was buried under yet another false name. To this day, no one knows who he really was. Theories have spiraled for centuries. A disgraced noble, perhaps an Italian diplomat, the twin brother of King Louis, perhaps even a valet who happened to know too much about royal corruption. None have ever been proven, and that was the whole point. A human being with a name, a personality, a past, and hopes for the future had been removed from history, memory, and even themselves, remaining only as semi-mythical legend, a man behind an iron mask. The oubliette wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was an act of erasure. It's the 11th of October 1652. We're in a Dutch fort on the shores of Table Bay in modern-day Cape Town, where a sailor named Jan Blank is in very big trouble. He's just been found hiding in the wilderness around the settlement. Authorities are relieved to find him. He had been missing for 9 days after all. But to the commander of Table Bay, a man named Jan van Riebeck, this sudden disappearance looks a bit like a case of desertion. And the sentence for this crime is perhaps the worst naval punishment in human history. Keelhauling. To make matters more troubling, under the justice system of the Dutch VOC, Jan Blank is not entitled to a fair trial under the judgment of his peers. Instead, Commander van Riebeck and a few of his inner circle will decide whether or not Blank is guilty of this accusation, and or his punishment should be. Behind closed doors, Riebeck and his lieutenants come to a decision within only a couple of hours. Jan Blank is found guilty of desertion, and for just 9 days of being AWOL, he is sentenced to an unbelievably savage fate. He's to be keelhauled, then to receive 150 lashes, and on top of that, he will then be enslaved for 2 years as punishment for deserting the VOC. Quite an expensive 9-day holiday. The process began by running a line of rope underneath the vessel, either along or across the keel, the backbone of the ship. Which way the rope was sent depended on the severity of the crime and whether or not the authorities wanted the victim to survive. Since Jan Blank was sentenced to 150 lashes and then 2 years of slavery after his keelhauling, it's reasonable to assume that the rope was installed sideways under the ship rather than along the entirety of its length. Either way, once the length of rope had been fastened, the victim was then tied to this line by the hands and feet and would be shoved off the side of the vessel and plunged into the water. Given the size of typical Dutch vessels during the 17th century, this would have been equivalent to falling from a one-storey building, and at that height, the water would feel almost solid if you struck it at an awkward angle. Since Jan had his hands and feet fastened, he was almost guaranteed to essentially belly flop into the ocean, stunning his body completely with the slam, whilst his scream was muffled with seawater. Given this was October, the water itself could have been as low as 5 degrees Celsius. Even without the physical trauma, hypothermia would have been a considerable risk. By this stage, Jan Blank is in complete pain all over his body, his hands and feet are bound, he's blind under the water, and most crucially, he can't breathe. All of this already, and the actual process hasn't even begun yet. It wouldn't be until he had landed in the water and the crew had tightened the rope that the true torment could commence. With a stern command from the officer, the men would begin to heave the rope from the opposite side of the ship, dragging the victim along the belly of the vessel. And here's where it gets so much worse than you think. See, the underside of these naval vessels did not look at all like the varnished, neatly kept decks that were maintained above water. Instead, the belly would be riddled with barnacles, flaking wood corroded by salt, and algae or mossy slime. All of this makes for a slippery surface studded with razor-sharp crustacean shells, barnacles in particular, which form knife-like ridges that can be several centimetres thick. The process would be equal in effect to dragging someone over a bed of serrated blades, broken in pieces and arranged at irregular patterns. Those forced to pull the line had a heartbreaking decision to make for their comrade underwater. Pull too slow, and the victim will drown before he reaches the other side. Pull too fast, and he might not make it in one piece. As Jan Blank felt the tugging on the rope, he would descend further into the black water and eventually be ground into shreds against the underside of the ship. Even lightly brushing barnacle-covered rocks whilst swimming can lead to some pretty nasty gashes, so being physically dragged across them would have been catastrophic. As Blank's skin and flesh was ripped away from his back, arms and legs, he would have also been scalped by whichever razor-sharp shell dug into his skull. And the whole time, he would be unable to take a breath or scream, nor would he have any way of knowing how much longer the process would take. We don't know how long Blank spent underwater, but we know that he survived because after being dragged out from the sea, he was left to hang for hours, still tied to the rope, with limbs and fingers half amputated and his face and head completely disfigured by the countless lacerations and gashes inflicted on him. To add salt to the wound, quite literally, the ocean spray lapping off of the ship would continue to season his wounds, making an already bloody and painful fate that much more excruciating. And although he was breathing for now, his odds for future survival were miserably low. Barnacles often carry bacteria and other microorganisms, and since his wounds were now festering in salt and filth, infection became the next ordeal to combat. Sepsis, tetanus, and gangrene were now major risks, and in a pre-antibiotic world, these are often as good as death sentences. This is part of the reason that keelhauling was so utterly dreaded by sailors. Even if you were able to survive the ordeal of being torn apart under the belly of the vessel, and you were able to hold your breath long enough to avoid drowning, you were still very likely to die from your wounds, or in the case of extreme luck, be just permanently disfigured. As a half-dead, wholly broken Jan Blank dangled over the mast of the ship for his crewmates to gawp at, it must have been front and centre of his mind that survival would still not be the end of his torments. He still had 150 lashes with a cat of nine tails to endure, an unthinkably high number when 50 lashes alone is often enough to kill a man. And of course, should he survive that, 2 years of slavery to endure. It was recorded that he did go on to take those lashes, but our sources stop there, and we're not sure if Jan was sent off to slavery afterwards in a completely crippled and useless state, or if he passed away during the lashing. Either way, for his fellow sailors in the VOC, many will remember Jan Blank's fate by the keelhauling, a process that was reserved for Dutch seamen found guilty of the worst possible crimes. I mentioned Dutch sailors specifically because during this time, the Netherlands was the only navy that actually had keelhauling as an official punishment for delinquents, with other major navies at the time, such as the French and British, preferring to use other punishments. In fact, the word itself actually comes from the Dutch term keelhalen, which literally translates to keelpauling, or of course, keelhauling. Although it's worth bearing in mind that the fact that it was only officially practiced by the Dutch doesn't mean that they were the only ones doing it, and there are controversies surrounding its unofficial use on voyages far from home, including an incident in 1880 when George Shaw Lefebvre was confronted in Parliament with a recent report from Italy of a keelhauling on HMS Alexandria, although he denied that such an incident had ever taken place. It's also a bit of a myth that this was a pirate punishment. I would imagine pirates did probably use it in some cases, but the best records are of official uses under state navies like the VOC. This actually isn't that surprising, since pirates didn't really have the same level of hierarchy aboard the ships, and they were typically much more egalitarian in terms of organisational structure, relying more on mutual cooperation and collective decision-making instead of top-down command, which relied on discipline to maintain order amongst crew members. Let's remember also that all pirates, by default, lived under the constant threat of death, since any caught by the authorities were hanged. So these people were already risking their lives every day. Execution, therefore, as a means of deterrence and persuasion, doesn't really work the same way. That said, though, with full crew support, capital punishments could be meted out, but these were rare, and keelhauling was even rarer, with usual punishments being marooning or a simple bullet. But this video is about keelhauling, not pirates, and although it was only officially practiced by the Dutch Navy, one of the best records we actually have for keelhauling comes from the British, although it should be said that they were actually watching the whole affair rather than doing the gruesome act themselves. And this first-hand account appears in a late 19th century issue of the Marlborough Express. I'll do my best to summarise it here for you, but I've left a link to the article itself in the description. The whole thing went down off the coast of Alexandria, where a British journalist saw 2 Egyptian sailors who were sentenced to this fate after committing what he describes as unnameable crimes under Ottoman law. The men were tied together and then to a rope that had run down the keel of the ship, so this time it was lengthways all the way down the spine, and then they were shoved overboard. To quote, "They both screamed as they fell into the water, and as the distance from the gangway to the surface was quite 14 feet, they must have been more or less hurt. But this was only the beginning of their miseries." The crew were then told to haul the rope, and a band on the ship started playing a solemn tune. And to quote again, "I saw the 2 wretches go under and disappear. From the time they went under the surface of the water till they reappeared at the other side of the ship was just 24 seconds. It seemed to us to have been an hour." Then, the author tells us that these unfortunate souls were forced to undergo the process not once, but twice, and to use his words, "The first frightful journey had terminated by their being scratched and torn. At the end of the second, they were mutilated. The nose of one wretch was torn straight away, one ear was gone, and the shreds of the clothing he had worn clung to him only where they were held by his bonds." He was blood, literally, from head to foot. His companion's condition was equally horrible. After this, they were then left to dangle off the side of the ship before eventually being scraped up the side of the vessel, striking against the ring bolts, the chains, and every cruel obstruction until they swung in free over the deck. Finally, they were released untied, both unconscious and most likely dead. At this stage, the correspondent actually asks those aboard if the men were dead, and he was told by the crew that it wasn't a matter of public concern. And then finally, he tells us that, nevertheless, we were offered coffee and cigarettes. It is needless to say that we did not accept either. For my part, I should rather have seen the ship's company shot than accept any hospitality at the hands of its officers. So, needless to say, this correspondent didn't like what he saw. Now, this has all been pretty dark and troubling so far, so I'd like to end on another story about keelhauling that, frankly, blew my socks off. And although it still involves some gruesome details, it's such a banger of a story that when I came across it during my research, I just had to share it with you. So, in the 19th century, there was a 17-year-old Spanish kid named Pedro Ramon y Cajal. You may recognise this name because he's actually the brother of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, the Nobel Prize winner who founded the study of neuroscience. In fact, in the academic world, all of Pedro's family were pretty big hitters, and expectations were high for his studies and performance. But in 1871, he failed one of his exams, and since he was utterly terrified of his father's reaction, he decided to just skip town, and instead of facing the music, he walked to France, where he then boarded a ship called Queen, which was bound for South America. Since Pedro didn't have any money, he decided to essentially sneak on board as a stowaway, but since it was a 3-month journey across the Atlantic, he was, predictably, found during the voyage. Once he was discovered, the crew demanded that he pay the price for the ticket, and when he explained that he didn't have the money to pay them, they decided that the next best thing was to make him pay in blood, and so he was subjected to keelhauling. But due to the fact that the ship was relatively new and had just been prepped for the journey, the belly of the vessel was more or less clean of barnacles, and he was fortunate enough to survive the whole process in more or less one piece. This clearly did not teach him the lesson that it should have, and just a few days later, after being back on his feet, he got involved in a dispute with an Italian passenger which ended in a knife fight, and that Italian dying as a result. 3 months or so later, Pedro makes land in Uruguay, sometime around early 1872, lost, and without much of a plan, he decides to join up with some revolutionary forces involved in a civil war, eventually sustaining a wound to his chest that leaves a nasty scar for the rest of his life. However, after his injury, he's taken off of the front line, and it's discovered by his superiors that despite Pedro's passion for adventure, he's actually quite an educated young chap, and literacy in the area was in short supply. So, Pedro gets a tasty promotion, becoming secretary to none other than Brigadier Timoteo Aparicio. By this stage, he's in his early 20s and has run away from home after a failed exam, been keelhauled, had a knife fight at sea, and survived an enormous battlefield injury to the chest, whilst also being a 3-month voyage from home. And now, he's secretary to one of the most powerful men in South America. I think we can all agree, young Pedro has done very well to land on his feet after such a turbulent start to life. But, to no one's surprise, he makes another rash decision, and within a few years would find himself back in hot water after trying to desert by stealing his boss's horse and pistol and then hightailing it into the countryside. After being captured, the jig was up, and Pedro was found guilty of desertion. He was lucky though, and his fate was not to be keelhauling, but instead death by firing squad. But once again, fortune intervened, and after some diplomatic wiggling, with his dad pulling strings behind the scenes, Pedro finds himself pardoned with all charges dropped, and in 1878 he returns to Spain a free man, and then goes on to start producing groundworking research with his brother on neurology, as well as making his own waves in the field of histology, which is the study of organic tissue in living things. He would go on to live until the age of 96, finally passing away in December of 1950, making him one of the last people in living memory to ever witness, let alone be, a victim of keelhauling. So, yes, quite a life, and fortunately for the scientific community, one that was not cut to ribbons under the belly of a ship. Most, of course, were not so lucky. It's 255 BC, and a Roman general named Marcus Atilius Regulus is forced to surrender himself and what's left of his forces after a disastrous rout at the Battle of Tunis. Regulus had just been defeated by a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, who was hired by Rome's enduring Mediterranean nemesis, Carthage. Regulus doesn't know it yet, but losing this battle is going to cost him more than he can imagine. Thousands of his comrades are marched off into a life of slavery, and Regulus himself will succumb to one of the worst fates possible, an ancient punishment few today have ever heard of: the barrels, an unbelievably cruel and painful method of execution which churns the victim into mush slowly and with much suffering along the way. But it doesn't go down how you might think, and the story itself is just as interesting as the punishment. See, after being taken into custody in 255 BC, Regulus would go on to spend the next 5 years in captivity under the Carthaginians. And we're not sure, by the way, of what conditions he was kept in, whether it was more of a house arrest type deal or a grim cell in the baking hot sun. Either way, after half a decade, the Carthaginians are confident that they've broken the man's unquestioning loyalty to Rome. And so they offer him the deal of a lifetime. They'll let Regulus go free, they'll even let him return to Rome. All he needs to do is influence the Roman Senate towards making a peace deal with Carthage, but only on the condition that he pinky promises to return back to Carthage if he's unsuccessful. Regulus takes the deal, makes the pinky promise, and by sometime around 250 BC, he's back in Rome, soothing troubled waters between the two Mediterranean superpowers. Or so Carthage thinks. In reality, Regulus picks up right where he left off 5 years or so ago. He tells the Senate to reject any peace treaties, to keep up the fight, and to push on to final victory. He tells the audience he's been in Carthage for half a decade now, and he can see them starting to weaken. The Senate heeds his advice. The war is back on. Regulus had done the exact opposite of what the Carthaginians had sent him to Rome to do. And there would be an almighty comeuppance for this impudence, if Regulus was still in Carthage, but for now, he's safely back in Rome. But then Regulus does something that shocks everyone. He tells the Roman Senate he's going back to Carthage anyway, simply because he promised on his own honour that he would return if he was unsuccessful. Unsuccessful is perhaps the most understated way to put doing the exact opposite of what you agreed to do, but nonetheless, to Regulus, a deal was a deal. The Senate beg him to reconsider, and they even come up with the idea of a prisoner exchange, so everyone can go home and still save face. But Regulus refuses, stating that giving strong and healthy Carthaginian prisoners back to Rome's mortal enemy is a price too high to pay to save the life of an old and sickly Regulus. To quote Cicero, he did not want the prisoners to be returned because he believed it was not advantageous to the state. And though he knew what torments and tortures were in store for him if he returned to the enemy, he still kept his oath. For he believed that an oath should be never broken, not even under duress. With this, Regulus returns to Carthage, and he'll pay for his disobedience and his honesty in blood and flesh. The ordeal began by having Regulus methodically starved over days and weeks in order to weaken his resolve and diminish his physical appearance. In the days directly leading to the execution, sleep deprivation becomes a tool of torment, and before long, it's the big day. We don't know the exact date of his execution, but sometime around 250 BC, he was finally put to death. The day started with his captors barging into his cell and then slicing off his eyelids so that he could neither blink nor shut his eyes. Within minutes under the Mediterranean sun, this would have rendered Regulus blind to whatever happened next, which might have been a good thing in his case. After this, he was stuffed into a barrel lined with hundreds of spikes before the lid was applied and hammered down, locking him inside the spiked chamber. The historical records we have for this execution are quite spotty, but I've seen this method of execution pop up in a few historical texts recently, and they all got me wondering, Would they have thrown Regulus into the barrel and then driven the spikes through while he was inside, potentially stabbing him with each new nail driven home? Or was the barrel already studded with these nails when they stuffed him in, meaning that the ripping and tearing of the flesh around the legs and arms as he was shoved down into the barrel was part and parcel of the torture? I'm not sure, but one thing we are sure about though is that this didn't kill him, because it wouldn't be until he was actually inside the barrel that the execution itself would begin. The method here is predictable, simple, and quite honestly, savage. Once he was inside the barrel, they kicked it over so that it was sideways, causing unimaginable wounds as he was slammed down onto the dozens and dozens of sharpened nails. And then, once the barrel was horizontal, they simply rolled it down a hill, at the bottom of which was the sea. I needn't state that this would be a bad way to die. As the barrel begins rolling and picking up momentum, the centrifugal force would fling the victim inside onto the spikes over and over. The body would then slam against these sharpened nails harder and faster with each rotation. Multiple deep puncture wounds would occur instantly. If Regulus was lucky, a major artery or a part of the skull would have been penetrated first. But this is by no means a given. Even without the spikes, rolling someone in a barrel down a steep enough hill would break bones and rupture organs. The spine itself could even be snapped if the body folds awkwardly during the rolling. Add to this horror the thought of being impaled hundreds of times with each passing second, and we're getting close to what Regulus endured. Eventually, the force inside the barrel would be enough to penetrate the abdomen or chest, hitting major organs like the heart, lungs, liver, or kidneys. And again, if lucky, the skull, resulting in an instant death. If this went on for long enough, the victim inside would quite literally be ground into an unrecognizable collection of torn apart flesh, like the messy floor of an abattoir. In the case of Regulus, however, he eventually was rolled into the sea, meaning that if he was still alive by the time the rolling had finished, which is unlikely but very much possible, then he would finally succumb by drowning, struggling against the inside of the spiked barrel with whatever functional limbs he had left, whilst his lungs slowly filled with seawater. Thus was the fate of Regulus, although it should be said that the sources do tell conflicting stories about what actually happened. Another version of the story is that he was locked into a large box studded with spikes and left inside to basically rot to death. And another version just says that he died in captivity, possibly from neglect or old age rather than cruelty. But before you walk away disappointed, there is another form of punishment by barrel which we have much more thorough records for, and luckily it's not quite as cruel as the fate of Regulus. And it's not an ancient punishment either. It's a medieval one. In 1551, England passed the Ale Houses Act, which made excessive drunkenness a civil offence. And the punishment for this offence was called the drunkard's cloak. It's just a barrel with the bottom cut out and a smaller opening at the top for the head to come through, so that the victim could be placed inside and would essentially be forced to wear the barrel. John Willis recorded its use in the 17th century, and to quote, "Men drove up and down the streets with a great tub or barrel opened in the sides with a hole in one end to put through their heads and to cover their shoulders and bodies down to the small of their legs. And so make the march to the view of all beholders, and this is their punishment for drunkards or the like." Although it seems quite funny to us today, and it is primarily a form of punishment by public humiliation and ridicule, it is worth keeping in mind that this still would have been extremely painful to endure, as the weight and shape of the barrel bears down on your shoulders, which would be forced into really unnatural positions. There are records of people having shoulders dislocated as a result. Oliver Cromwell was also very fond of this method of punishment during his tyrannical repression under the guise of Puritanism in the 17th century. And then, interestingly enough, in the 20th century, during the Great Depression, the barrel would make a bit of a comeback. This time, not as a form of punishment, but as a means of representing extreme poverty, implying that the unfortunate soul forced to wear the barrel is unable to even afford basic clothing. The bankruptcy barrel has even appeared in the 21st century as part of wider protests and social commentary, such as this photo taken during the Occupy Wall Street protests. So, if there is a moral of the story today, I guess it's that the commonly virtuous act of keeping a promise can get you into some very unpleasant circumstances, but getting drunk seems to have far less intimidating consequences. That is, as long as you can handle the uncomfortable cloak and a stiff hangover. Interesting tidbit, I'm actually filming this while hungover because yesterday I was celebrating the fact that we got 100,000 subscribers. So thank you very much for your support. You guys are awesome. In the meantime, be careful who you make your promises to. It's the 10th of June, 1857. We're in Peshawar. Today it's a city in Pakistan, but back then it was a strategic foothold in the northwestern corner of British India, under the administration of the Bengali presidency. What should be just another balmy summer's day on this sleepy fringe of the empire is unfortunately starting to look rather menacing. Imperial soldiers from all corners of Her Majesty's realm are running back and forth in their military uniforms, carrying gunpowder, shouting marching orders, and stuffing grape-shot ammo into cannons crested on the horizon. It all looks like the prelude to some great clash of powers. But this is no battle. In fact, this is an execution. Today, these great lumbering beasts of smoke and fire and steel won't be used to smash down fortresses or carve holes through ranks of cavalry. Instead, they'll be used to quite literally tear the condemned limb from limb, one at a time. 40 men, to be exact, each guilty of rebelling against the British rule in India. All will soon be subjected to a punishment so excessive it borders on theatrical, an almost comical level of ballistic overkill. These condemned men are sepoys, soldiers native to India that had been employed by the British to maintain order and security in the region. They had since, however, been found guilty of rebelling against the empire. The British would ensure that this disobedience would be paid for in blood, and that they go out with a hell of a bang, so that everyone else got the message. As these broken, failed rebels were marched out towards their site of execution, their composure began to break. Most would have expected to be hanged or shot by firing squad. No one would have imagined being torn apart at point-blank range by cannon. It would have been difficult to surprise these wretches by this point too, having endured days of torture since being captured. One particularly humiliating punishment was forcing them to clean a chamber where executions had recently taken place. Since the sepoys were said to have been the ones guilty of spilling blood in the first place, they were given neither mops nor rags to clean the clotting sanguine off of the floor, but told instead to get on their knees and use their tongues. To add to the torment, chili powder was applied to pried open eyes, and intimate areas were branded with red-hot pincers. You might think that, in the light of all this suffering, such a swift and sudden end would be a relief to the sepoys. But this method of execution was particularly terrifying to them, since they believed that in order to have peace in the afterlife, they would need to be buried whole, and the cannons would make sure there was nothing but scraps to bury. Since there were more prisoners than there were guns, most would have to sit and watch the ordeal before it was their turn, adding to the horror. Once the guns were loaded and primed to fire, the men were taken one by one and strapped to the business end of the cannon, so that the point of the gun rested in the small of the victim's back, and their arms laid outstretched, fastened to the wheel on each side of the gun. With that, the fuse was unceremoniously lit. The sound of cannon blast ripped through the air. Dust was kicked up into the faces of spectators, and the man strapped to the mouth of the cannon simply ceased to exist, denied his right to live on either in this life or the next. An English soldier named George Arthur Stent witnessed the event and described the process in painful detail. When the gun is fired, his head is seen to go straight up into the air at some 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left, high up in the air, and fall all at perhaps 100 yards distance. The legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun, and the body is literally blown away altogether, not a vestige being seen. Death would have been instant, of course, but those who were forced to go next onto the cannon would have had to march through the strewn entrails of their atomized comrades and had the hot steel of the gun pressed into their naked back, knowing that within mere moments they would be turned inside out with a thunderous shot as their bodies consumed in the violent smoke. All that was left then would be to join their comrades in an afterlife of torment and shame. To quote an excerpt from an 1867 edition of The Times, the rebels were punished in a manner they understood. The body was destroyed, the soul was denied. But all of this begs the question, what had the Sepoys done to deserve this eccentric death sentence, and why was the British Empire using a military tool for such a theatric and brutally extreme form of capital punishment? This is the story of execution by cannon. By the mid-18th century, the British East India Company had transformed from a trading enterprise into a powerful military and political force, steadily expanding its control over the vast and diverse Indian subcontinent. But Britain was not the first to wield the power of gunpowder in India, nor was she the first to wrestle this grand territory into submission. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled large parts of India since the early 16th century, was among the first South Asian powers to master firearms, employing cannons and matchlock guns to conquer and consolidate territories. It was under the Mughal Empire that the first execution by cannons was seen in India. Although stubborn in her own way, Britain was keen to pick up a new trick when convenient, and the legacy of tearing renegades and rebels apart at the muzzle of a gun was then passed from the Mughals to the British, who continued using it as a tool to terrorise disobedient locals. In 1760, it became a regular feature of imperial law and order in China, but it wasn't just locals in the firing line. In 1798, mutiny broke out amongst the British soldiers in the 1st Battalion of the Madras Foot Artillery. One British soldier was condemned to be blown from a gun. Others would write home of their experiences on watching an execution with the cannon. One such account reads as follows. After the explosion, the grouping of the men's remains was very frightful. One man's head was perched upon his back, staring around as if looking for his arms and legs. A cloud like a dust storm composed of burning muscle, fat, shreds of clothing, lumps of coagulated blood, a stomach or a liver came falling down in a stinking shower. To add to the humiliation and disgrace, birds of prey and stray dogs would often circle the execution grounds, waiting patiently for a chance to swoop in on an easy meal. Some birds were reported to be brave enough to get so close to the cannon that they could catch goblets of half-cooked flesh as it was blown through the air. But while Britain was game to learn a few nasty tricks from India and the Mughals, she also had plans to reshape the continent in her own image, sparking a centuries-long debate around the ethics of empire. With the building of a modern infrastructure and the building of a European-style army also came moral reforms, much of which rubbed locals the wrong way. By 1829, the practice of sati was banned in India. Sati, if you didn't know, was an ancient custom in which a husband's widow is burned alive on his funeral pyre. Its banning was seen as a fantastic moral triumph for Britain, who was not just throwing her weight around in the colonies, but could now comfortably play the argument that she was a civilizing force. Over the following decades, educational reforms saw English replace Persian as the administrative language, and missionary-run schools started to promote Western values and Christian ethics, often dismissing native faiths such as Hinduism and Islam in the process. The most outrageous changes, however, occurred in the military. Britain established Indian regiments of soldiers called sepoys, modelled in the European style. Some of these sepoy regiments completely abolished and forbade the acknowledgement or practice of the Indian caste system in favour of a more meritocratic and pragmatic method of organising ranks in the military. Instead of being born with a social rank that translated to your military position, soldiers now had to start on the same playing field and earn promotions either through outstanding service or through time spent in the regiment. In theory, it was a fair way to distinguish soldiers from one another and have an army run by the best soldiers in the regiment. In reality, it was unbelievably offensive. The caste system had been around in India for nearly 3,000 years, and now members of the low and high classes were sharing the same sleeping quarters or enjoying a meal at the same table. It was, to them, outrageous. But so far, Britain had been able to keep these simmering tensions under wraps, and through a calculated mix of diplomacy and force, she was able to quell minor uprisings and calm local fears that Britain was trying to Christianize India. All was well in the jewel of the crown, and there was no need for any mass displays of blowing people apart with cannons. That was, until a minor argument outside a munitions factory spilled into a full-blown scandal. As I mentioned earlier, the caste system in India was no joke. It governed everything from birth to burial. So when a low-caste munitions worker tried to sit alongside a sepoy from a higher caste, he was quickly rebuffed and told to remember his place in the pecking order. But the worker wasn't pleased. Furious, he shot back that the sepoy had no right to claim high caste status. Why? Because, he claimed, the very rifle the sepoy carried, the new British-made Enfield, had made him ritually impure. To the sepoy's horror, the worker explained that the rifle's cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow tallow and pig lard, and since loading the weapon required biting the cartridge open with the teeth, the sepoy, without even knowing, had just violated both Hindu and Muslim dietary laws, the cow being sacred to Hindus and pork being forbidden to Muslims. So, with every shot fired, the sepoy was swallowing sin, and now the low-caste worker said smugly that since every word the sepoy said was for a mouthful of cow fat, they were technically equals. This petty quarrel between a soldier and a factory worker lit the fuse on what would become a continent-wide explosion, a rebellion that would shake the British Empire to its core and eventually lead us to the cannons. It didn't actually matter whether this rumour was true, though it probably was. The East India Company scrambled to contain the fallout, insisting the cartridges weren't greased at all, or issuing new ones that could be torn open by hand. But to many, these were just panicked half-measures, and all the more proof that Britain had, in fact, been caught trying to destroy local religions and replace them with Christianity. In Meerut, the pot boiled over. When 85 sepoys refused to bite the cartridge, they were shackled and jailed in front of their comrades. That night, the barracks erupted in violence. Prisoners were freed, officers were shot, civilians were butchered, and the rebellion had begun. They then marched to Delhi, raised the old Mughal standard, and declared Bahadur Shah II the Emperor of Hindustan, a ghost of an empire called back from the grave. For a moment, it looked like history might be rewritten. This started more or less a civil war, and it was absolutely savage for both sides. One witness, a British woman named Julia Inglis, wrote, "The air was thick with smoke. The houses were burning on every side. There were dreadful sights, bodies horribly mutilated, women and children lying in pools of blood. It was as if hell had come to earth." The harder the sepoys and the rebels hit, the more brutal Britain was in return. To quote Reverend Gopal Chandra, the white men killed everything. Men, women, even children. Anyone brown was a rebel to them. The blood ran down the streets like water. By June, Britain had managed to capture some of the sepoys in British India's northwest. The pocket of resistance there had been temporarily stabilised, and now it was time to punish, publicly, to drive the message home. Blasting from a cannon seemed like a fitting punishment, and many of the British soldiers felt personal animosity towards the rebel sepoys. No one was in the mood for mercy. And so we find ourselves back on the field outside Peshawar with 40 men being lined up to be blown to pieces by fire and gunpowder. It's interesting to note that it was Britain's insensitivity towards local religious customs that had kicked this whole thing off. But now that it was time to punish, all of a sudden they were able to pick the exact method of execution that was most religiously consequential. And so the Sepoy's story ended with the cannons. But the bloodshed in India would continue, claiming somewhere between 100,000 and 1,000,000 lives by 1859. It was also not the last time that the cannon would be used as a tool of execution and power. But despite its fame and theatric quality, blasting someone from a cannon is a wildly impractical affair, bound to go wrong at some point and utterly reckless even when done properly. Although typically the cannon would not be loaded with an actual round, sometimes mistakes were made. In one case, a cannon was loaded with grape shot, which can be thought of as a kind of shotgun effect, except on steroids. And as the grape shot burst through the condemned man's stomach and shredded him to pieces, the projectiles themselves continued flying, eventually striking members of the crowd. Things got so bad in one case that members of the audience were requiring amputation after being struck with the shot. And even if the cannon is not loaded, as is usually the case, and it's merely the force of the explosion that tears the condemned to pieces, soldiers and spectators could often be peppered with chunks of flesh and slivers of bone, blasted into the air at such high speed that they embed themselves into anyone nearby. This is sometimes called wet shrapnel. And even when everything does go to plan, one must always account for chance and botched attempts. One eyewitness account recalls such an event. One wretched fellow slipped from the rope just before the explosion. His arm nearly ignited. Hanging in agony under the gun, a sergeant tried 3 times to shoot him, but the pistol misfired. Finally, a rifle was fired into the back of his head, and blood poured from his nose and mouth like water from a briskly handled pump. This was the most horrible sight of all. I have seen death in all of its forms, but never anything to equal this man's end. Horror stories like this would eventually begin to change opinion on the use of the cannon. If Britain was going to claim that she was a civilizing force, then she'd need to do a lot better than these performative displays of brutal justice. By 1861, it would be outlawed, and no one would ever again have to be blown apart by a cannon. The world finally moved on from this terrible practice. Until 10 years ago, when in 2015, reports started coming out of North Korea that political dissidents were being executed by being blasted at point-blank range with anti-aircraft guns. Although it must be said that these reports haven't been confirmed. Perhaps all of this is less to do with theories of justice and the ethics of empire, and instead Mao Zedong had hit the nail on the head with his famous quote that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Maybe it's as simple as that. It's May 1498. We're in the Republic of Florence. Girolamo Savonarola stands accused of heresy. But he won't confess to such a grave crime. After all, why would he? He's no heretic. In fact, he's a man of God. He believes wholeheartedly in the message that the Lord has delivered unto him. But deep in the Bargello Palace, there are chambers renowned for making men change their minds. It won't become Florence's notorious prison until the next century, but torture already takes place here. The Bargello is already full of devices, mechanisms, and machinery, designed to persuade. In the bowels of the palace, Savonarola meets his adversary, Il Strappado, a system of ropes and pulleys that mangles even the strongest of bodies and shatters the most resolute of minds. Savonarola is hoisted 4 times by the machine. He undergoes 4 agonizing drops, his shoulders contorted frighteningly behind him. The sounds of groaning ligaments, snapping sinews, reverberates off the walls of the Bargello's dungeon. And 4 is enough. He will confess. But then, by some miracle, his strength returns to him, and he changes his mind and recants his confession. But the machine doesn't care. The machine can go all day. Savonarola is hoisted up again, then down he drops once more, then back up, then down, and again, and again. Some accounts suggest he endures 10 more hoists and drops until finally he caves. He gives the interrogators what they want. And that seals the deal for Savonarola. He's a heretic, and now he'll die. He shows no emotion as he receives his sentence. After all, once you've experienced what he's experienced, death would be a release. This is the story of the Strappado. The torture of Strappado can be defined in different ways, but most share the same core elements. Generally, the victim's arms are pulled out behind them like a pair of wings, pulling the shoulders in a horrifically twisted, contorted position. The wrists are then tied together, and the victim is hoisted into the air. Their own body weight pulls them downwards, exerting sickening pressure on the joints. If you think that sounds bad enough, you'd be right, but the torturers seldom give up their chance to maximize the suffering they inflict on their fellow human beings. This is why things like squassation exist in the historical record, adding acute injury to the agonizing mix by dropping the victim from a height and catching them before they hit the ground. Other variations include attaching a heavy weight to the lower legs, essentially turning the Strappado into a vertical, gravity-assisted version of the rack, stretching victims until their sinews reach breaking point. The first records of Strappado emerge in Spain and Italy in the 15th century. In Italy, the unfortunate Girolamo Savonarola is one of the first people we know to have undergone the torture. In Spain, that dubious honour goes to Jaime de Montesa, but it's likely that neither of these unfortunate men were actually the first. Regardless of who was, though, the torment had become something of a trademark of the Florentine Republic by the late 15th century, and of the lords and dukes of the Medici, who ruled over the state both before and after. It has since spread across Europe and into the wider world. But how would this torment have felt, and what exactly did it do to the body? Strappado was designed to target the shoulders, twisting them horribly out of position until the joints dislocate. Artists' impressions of the torture show the humerus or upper arm bone pressing sickeningly against the skin of the victim's back as it's wrenched out of the socket in the shoulder blade. Needless to say, shoulders aren't supposed to move in this way. The body is not simply going to let this happen, and the muscles, ligaments, and tendons of the back and shoulders resist with all their might. This means an agonizing tug-of-war between gravity and the rope holding you up, with your soft tissue in between. Regardless of who wins, the outcome is the same. The soft tissue takes the full force and is torn asunder. The rotator cuff is where a lot of the force is concentrated. These are the muscles and tendons that keep your shoulder stable. The soft tissues found here can be injured in a lot of different ways, but when faced with the extreme trauma of the Strappado, they basically have no chance. Especially when you're experiencing squassation, the grim sequence of hoists and drops the torturers use to achieve the maximum levels of pain. With squassation, it's not a gradual, uniform pull from gravity you've got to worry about. It's the acute, sudden shock of a fall that rips the tendons with a sickening tug. This practice would have generated an enormous amount of force, channeling right into your shoulder joints, resulting in catastrophic harm. Extreme nerve damage would leave your arms and hands permanently debilitated. Injuries to the brachial plexus, the system of nerves stretching from the neck down to the arm, which could cause lasting weakness, numbness, even paralysis. Meanwhile, circulatory issues are highly likely, with the arms and shoulders constricted into these excruciating positions. The process itself puts great trauma on the blood vessels in your arms, resulting in ischemia. In simple terms, blood can't flow to where it's needed. If the blood flow is restricted too much, tissues in the hands and arms begin to black and necrotize. Essentially, your flesh dies and rots while still attached to your body. In most cases, though, this would be the last of your concerns. You won't be around long enough to experience any of the Strappado's long-term effects. The process itself won't usually kill you, and it's not designed to. What it does is set up a confession for the execution that typically follows. In Florence, Strappado is associated with some dramatic falls from grace. Girolamo Savonarola, for example, had quite literally been the de facto ruler of the state right up to March 1498, just 2 months before his torture and execution. But he was more than a political leader. He was also a preacher and a prophet, displeased by the ostentatious grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church. Savonarola began to proselytize a purer, more fundamental form of Christianity. In some ways, he was a man ahead of his time. Martin Luther was still only 14 years old when Savonarola was preaching his new ways of worship on the banks of the Arno River down in Florence. And it would be another 2 decades before Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses to the church doors of Wittenberg and kick-started the Protestant Reformation. But the Vatican wasn't interested in innovation and new ways of looking at things. They knew how to worship God, thank you very much. And the papacy wasn't too keen on having Florentine friars drawing attention to their private affairs either. The head of the Catholic Church at the end of the 15th century was Pope Alexander, also known as Roderick de Borja of the infamous Borgia family. While stories of wild Borgia excesses have probably been exaggerated a little down the years, largely centering on Roderick's illegitimate children Cesar and Lucrezia, there's probably still a degree of hedonistic truth to them. Also, the Pope had children. Popes weren't supposed to do that, although plenty did. So Alexander sent his men to Florence to report on what Savonarola was saying about him, and in 1495 the priest Sebastian Maggi issued his polite but forceful demand to the troublesome friar. Cease from public and private preaching until you are able to come to the Vatican's presence, not under armed escort, as is your present habit, but safely, quietly, and modesty, until we make different arrangements. Savonarola did not cease, and so those different arrangements were made, and yes, they were every bit as ominous as they sound. In 1498, Savonarola was condemned to trial by fire, the first in Florence since the 11th century. Incredibly, he passed his ordeal. A sudden rainstorm dampened the pyre and called a halt to proceedings, much to the annoyance of Alexander and his men. Had God intervened on the side of Savonarola? Probably not, but either way, this was far too embarrassing for the Catholic Church. So it was down into the depths of the Bargello for Savonarola to be lashed up to the Strappado and shown who was boss. Savonarola confessed he wasn't a prophet, he'd made everything up. Pope Alexander could go on living and worshipping just as he pleased. Despite his change of heart, Savonarola was hanged on May 23rd and his body burned to avoid any relic collection, though that didn't stop him from becoming a martyr for the Protestants who would follow in the next century. But even more so than Savonarola, Niccolò Machiavelli is perhaps the most famous name to be subjected to the Florentine version of Strappado. And there is a certain bitter irony to this. Whichever way you decide to interpret Machiavelli's work, when taken at face value, treatises like The Prince advocate brutal tyranny from the ruling classes. This means Machiavelli's words supported torture and violent repression, even if the man himself didn't necessarily mean what he wrote. Machiavelli's star was rising, just as Savonarola's was falling. Not much is actually known of Niccolò before 1498, but he certainly thrived and flourished as a diplomat under Savonarola's successor, Pier Soderini. The return of the Medici family to the seats of power in Florence in 1513 was both a professional blessing for Machiavelli and a personal curse. It was a blessing because without the return of the Medicis, he'd probably never have written The Prince, and we probably never would have heard of him. And it was a curse because, in order to achieve his controversial immortality, he first had to take a trip down into the bowels of the Bargello and endure a few rounds with Il Strappado. Machiavelli took his own journey into the clutches of the machine in February 1513 after he was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy against the Medicis. For weeks, the accusations were put to him. 6 times he was hoisted and dropped upon the machine, and 6 times he maintained his innocence. Even with a body twisted by torture and a mind driven mad by pain, Machiavelli did not crack. But such resilience wasn't necessarily what saved Machiavelli's life. Political historian Graham Garrote believes that the only reason he wasn't executed was because of the amnesty called after Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X on March 1513. But after surviving such a harrowing experience, Machiavelli more or less retreated from public life, retiring to the countryside where he wrote many of his most famous pieces of work, including The Prince. He seems to have been largely unfazed by his torture, and in the words of Graham Garrote again, he took his torture on the Strappado admirably well, even writing some amusing sonnets about it. So the Strappado may have become associated with the dungeons of Florence, but it was already being used in Spain by this time, and was still being put to use centuries later. The Spanish Inquisition were a truly terrifying group of religious fanatics, obsessed with rooting out heresy in the most brutal fashion. This meant using methods like the toca, which was essentially an early form of waterboarding, and the potro, stretching upon the rack. Of course, for men as brutal as these, they always loved the Strappado, or as they called it, the garrucha or the hoist. Garrucha meant tying the victim's hands behind their back, lifting them into the air, and then, you guessed it, dropping them several feet before allowing the rope to pull tight upon their twisted limbs. Records show Jaime de Montesa being tortured in this way as early as 1487. Around 70 years old at the time, Montesa's body would have struggled to withstand the torment placed upon it. He swiftly confessed to planning and organising the murder of Inquisitor Pedro Arbues 2 years earlier. As a convert from Judaism to Christianity and an outspoken opponent of the Inquisitors, Montesa was a target basically from the start, and his confession brought him no leniency. 10 days later, he was beheaded in Zaragoza's Market Square. That same day, August 20th, 1487, James' daughter Leonor was burned alive for heresy. The accusation of heresy could mean a lot of things in 15th century Europe, and in Leonor's case, it just meant observing the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, and for that, she died horribly. Spanish artist Francisco Goya gives us an evocative depiction of the garrucha in action. The sketch comes from the early 1800s, but it's likely depicting a much earlier event. But this is not to say that the garrucha, strappado, and similar practices had actually died out by Goya's time. In fact, they haven't fully died out to this day. During the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese forces used similar tactics on American and South Vietnamese prisoners, adopting a process known as the rope trick. Robert Weidman, a Navy pilot who ended up in North Vietnamese custody after his plane went down in 1967, explained just how much the rope trick was feared and how it helped North Vietnam achieve its aims. The rope trick hurts like crazy and will get you to say anything. But after President Johnson suspended the bombing campaign, they stopped using the rope trick. And then again, as late as 1999, 5 Bulgarian nurses and a Palestinian intern were arrested in Libya on spurious charges of deliberately causing an HIV epidemic at a children's hospital in Benghazi. The detainees were subjected to torture such as floggings, beatings, electric shocks, and of course, the strappado. Nurse Snezhana Dimitrova outlined the torture she'd experienced between 1999 and 2003. They tied my hands behind my back, then they hung me from a door. It feels like they are stretching you from all sides. My torso was twisted, and my shoulders were dislocated from their joints from time to time. The pain cannot be described. And again, during the Iraq War, these same methods were used during the interrogation and torture of Manadel al-Jamadi at the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad in 2003. Al-Jamadi did not survive his ordeal. Though several American soldiers were convicted of the maltreatment of the prisoners at Abu Ghraib, no one has ever been charged in direct connection with al-Jamadi's killing. Though undoubtedly lethal in some cases, strappado was never supposed to be an instrument of murder. It's a method of questioning, of interrogation, of investigation. Only, as we've seen, it's not really very good at those things either. In the Florentine Republic, deep in the Bargello, there was no fact-finding at work. When Girolamo Savonarola was interrogated, his tormentors already had in mind what they wanted him to say. It was just a matter of seeing how long he'd last on the machine, and how many drops it would take before he gave them what they wanted. It was the same story for Machiavelli. His torturers would have got their confessions sooner or later. His skin was only saved when, out of the blue, one of the Medicis was made pope. In Zaragoza, poor old Jaime de Montesa was not questioned in any real sense. He was simply the victim of violent persecution on account of his Jewish background. Similarly, the case of Robert Weidman in Hanoi, he had little information to give. Instead, his suffering was a bargaining tool to make Lyndon Johnson cave to North Vietnamese demands. Neither Snezhenia Dimitrova nor Manadela Jamadi were truly active participants in any investigation. They were just punching bags, ready to be mauled and humiliated by people who sought to take away the last shreds of their dignity. In Manadel's case, they took his life too. So, the Strappado might be many things, but it is not a method of intelligence gathering. The only answers you'll get from the Strappado are the answers the victim feels they need to give to make the torment stop. It's the year 91 AD. We're in Rome, where Cornelia, High Priestess of the Vestal Virgins, is about to meet her end. And it won't be a quick end either. Cornelia is to be bricked up in a small hollow within the city wall and left there to rot. Essentially, she'll be buried alive. So, Cornelia is bound, chained, and led through the Roman streets to the site of her execution. The crowds jeer at her, taunt her. This once revered priestess has brought shame to Rome after all. Her wantonness, they believe, her impropriety, has put them all in danger. But Cornelia is defiant to the last. Above the yells of the baying crowd, she cries out, "Caesar thinks that I am impure. I, who have performed so many rites by which he conquered and triumphed." Some in the crowd lower their voices in shame. Others simply ignore her and continue with their curses and insults. At the site of her execution, the grim procession comes to a halt. There are no gallows here, no chopping block, no stake ready for burning. There's only a small hole with a chamber beneath. Into this hole Cornelia is pushed, and in this chamber she will spend the rest of her days, however many of those may remain. As she manoeuvres into the dusty cell beneath the city wall, stepping over the awkward jumble of bricks that will be used to seal her prison, her long stola garment catches on the masonry. The priestess stumbles. Her executioner pauses and reaches out a hand for her to take, but she refuses. She insists that she'll take these last steps alone, and as she looks upon the light for one last time, its column shrinking, then disappearing in the darkness of her cell, she knows that she dies, an innocent woman. But that death will not be swift in coming. There are agonized hours ahead of her, days even, in which the physical and psychological torment of her imprisonment will work its way over her. As the skin-crawling judder of claustrophobia begins to set in, she wonders just how long it will take her to step across into the other world, and what will deal that final blow. Will it be starvation or thirst that finally takes her, or will she perhaps succumb to creeping madness? Cornelia is being put to death through what we now call immurement, a word that has its roots in the Latin of ancient Rome. Im meaning in or into, and murus meaning wall, quite literally being put into a wall. And now the process of bricking up begins. The hole in Cornelia's chamber grows smaller as bricks are added one by one. Sturdy Roman cement holds them in place, perhaps reinforced by pozzolana, the volcanic sand taken from the Bay of Naples. As the final stone is placed in Cornelia's prison, the last vestige of sunlight disappears from her view like a solar eclipse. Only this will be permanent. She will never again feel the warm Mediterranean sun upon her skin. Anxiety begins to rise within Cornelia. The sudden knowledge that escape is now impossible pulls at the fraying edges of her sanity. In the constricted space, her heart begins to gallop almost immediately. Breathing becomes difficult. Her capacity for rational thought starts to fail. But this anxiety won't be what kills her. We can't know exactly how long Cornelia remained alive in her prison. The priestess had enough oxygen to survive and did have shelter from daily heat and nightly cold. But beyond that, she had nothing else. No food and no water. Without this, Cornelia would have died within 3 days. But with no reference point for day or night, or the passage of time itself, those 3 days will stretch into an eternity of limbo, a state of not quite living, but still not quite dead. As she navigates this lonely journey into death, sensory deprivation will take a heavy toll. With no light for Cornelia to see by, a significant portion of her brain's function is impaired. Focus and concentration become impossible as she grows disorientated. Deep within the wall, her brain begins to work overtime. She begins to experience what will later become known as the Ganzfeld effect. Derived from the German for whole field, this is a sequence of hallucinations that occur when the brain is starved of visual stimuli and begins filling in its own gaps. She witnesses strange shifts in colour, the sensation of fading out, as if her whole being is shutting down. Strange shapes, lines, textures begin to swim back and forth across her eyes as they struggle to make sense of the gloom. Minute patterns, whether they're etched into the walls of her prison or just carried in the little columns of dust that float on the air, all of this begins to transmogrify into eerie beings as the brain experiences pareidolia, the instinctual conjuring of human faces which are not really present. Auditory hallucinations add to the disturbing sensory cocktail. In the cramped darkness of her cell, sounds are muffled and extinguished. Again, Cornelia's brain fills in the gaps, creating hushed voices out of nothing, even whole conversations between the ghostly, imaginary beings locked in there with her. At first, Cornelia will be able to manage these hallucinations. She'll understand what's going on and be aware that her brain is playing tricks on her. But as the hours pass, and as the knowledge that she's going to die in here settles in upon her, this resolution will begin to change. The borders between reality and hallucination begin to blur, then come apart altogether. Within a day or two, she'll experience a total psychological breakdown, her mind simply unable to process its seclusion. But all of this begs the question, what had Cornelia done to deserve such a miserable end? Well, as a Vestal Virgin, Cornelia was a member of one of the most important priestly orders in Rome, and as a Virgo Maxima, she was the most senior and most important of them all. It was these priestesses who oversaw the sacred hearth of Vesta and the flame that burned within it. And this wasn't just any flame, it was an eternal flame for the eternal city. The flame must be kept burning, otherwise, they believed, Rome would fall. So, 6 Vestals worked day and night to make sure the flame stayed lit. These 6 enjoyed quite a high status, but their task was an unenviable one. Each was chosen in early childhood, giving up family and personal attachments to devote 30 years of their lives to the flame. All 6 of the Vestals must take responsibility for the flame's survival and also for its purity. Curiously, it seems this purity was more important than the flame's survival, and the purity of the flame seems to depend entirely on the purity of each Vestalis herself. A Vestalis who allowed the flame to go out might be whipped, a horrendous and humiliating punishment for anyone, and an immense insult to a woman who's devoted 30 years of her life to the service of a flickering flame in a drafty temple. But at least she would have kept her life. If, though, on the other hand, a Vestalis was found guilty of incestum, which means just the loss of chastity, basically having a sexual partner, then she had to die. And that death was an execution, but it wasn't supposed to appear as such. It was supposed to look voluntary, a devoted priestess laying down her life for atonement, following an inexcusable sin. It must also be bloodless. Harming a Vestalis was an affront to the goddess of Vesta, and spilling the blood of a Vestalis was out of the question. So there would be no gory head-chopping here, no unedifying, inelegant tearing of flesh. Oh no, the Vestalis must meet her end in a manner befitting of her station. So a Vestalis guilty of incestum would go voluntarily to a chamber within the wall of Rome, where she would be bricked up for all eternity, or at least for the day or two it would take for dehydration to end her life for her. As it is, as you can imagine, quite difficult to commit incestum solo, there must have been other culprits involved too. The man or men with whom the unchaste act had supposedly been committed. Unlike the Vestales, however, these men would not be offered a voluntary, bloodless end, and instead they'd be taken out into a public place and beaten to death. As a result, in some cases, the authorities wouldn't need to go through with the immurement itself. Just the threat of the punishment would be enough to break any insubordination within the ranks of the Vestals. Roman historian Livy tells us of Postumia, a Vestalis who was put on trial. The fact that she dressed well and talked rather more freely and wittily than a young girl should justified the suspicion against her. Even in the brutality of ancient Rome, dressing well and talking witty were hardly enough to end someone's life. The court was simply using the idea of the immurement to scare Postumia straight, as Livy continues. She was afterwards acquitted with a warning from the emperor to stop making jokes and to dress in future with more regard to sanctity and less to elegance. So Postumia was spared. But as we know, Cornelia had no such luck. As she was accused of having actual sexual relations during her time as Virgo Maxima, her crime was considered far greater. Emperor Domitian, who had executed 3 Vestals in a similar fashion in recent years, was in no mood to acquit the priestess, although historian Pliny the Younger, who observed her march to death, was not totally convinced. She repeated her calls to Vesta and to other gods until she was led away to punishment. Whether she was innocent or not, I do not know, but she certainly acted innocent. Pliny was also touched by the fact that she refused her executioner's hand in her final moments above ground. Thus, she preserved her sanctity to the last and displayed all the tokens of a chaste woman. The names of the men Cornelia had supposedly committed incestum with are lost to history. In fact, little is known about Cornelia and her life at all, other than her status as the Virga Vestalis Maxima. Historians have found some records of Cornelia's serving in the College of the Vestals around this time, and there is actually some debate over which one of these rose to become the Virgo Vestalis Maxima. In a way, this just makes Cornelia's story all the sadder. A girl taken from her family devotes almost 30 years of her life to the goddess Vesta, only to be accused of a non-crime and put to death in one of the most horrible ways possible. We don't even know exactly when she died. We just know it was sometime in 91 AD, no more than 3 days after she was sealed up in her prison. By this point, there would have been no way back for the priestess. The lack of fluid would have reduced her blood volume and blood pressure to a lethal degree, or organs would have begun to fail. The sensation of shutting down would have very much been a real feeling. A heart attack, brain damage, or multi-organ failure would probably have spelt the end for Cornelia. A truly unpleasant way to go. But she is perhaps the most famous example of immurement, and the practice is closely associated with ancient Rome. However, it's not unique to the empire. The process plays upon one of humanity's fundamental fears: the fear of being buried alive. The universal nature of this terror made it a common punishment across medieval and early modern Europe, with subtle variations and peculiarities. Take another famous example, this time from the Kingdom of Hungary. In January 1611, a Hungarian countess endured a similar process, this time within a small chamber in her own home, the castle of Sashteche in modern-day Slovakia. Placed within this chamber, the wall behind her was bricked shut. Only a tiny hole remained, essentially a hatchway through which food and water could be passed. For the countess, death came slowly. She was essentially on life support, receiving the basic sustenance her body needed to stay alive, but nothing more. Her torment was subtler than that of Cornelia, but no less harrowing. It was a purely psychological torture for the countess, as she rattled around her chamber, losing grip on reality. Day and night became meaningless. Time ceased to be of relevance. She actually managed to survive 3.5 years of this mind-bending torment but she couldn't endure forever. She eventually met her death in 1614, aged 54. But whether you feel sympathy for the poor countess or not will depend on which side of the story you believe. The lady in question was Elizabeth Bathory of Exed, the famous bloody countess of Hungarian folklore, who bathed in the blood of virgins to keep herself young and may have murdered up to 650 young women. Or did she? She may have simply been a victim of jealousy and political manoeuvring. Bathory's main accuser was György Thurzó, the man appointed by the Countess's late husband, Count Ferenc Nadasdy, to take care of her, as well as her children and her fortune, once the Count had passed away. Thurzó took care of her all right. With the Count now safely in his grave, her supposed protector levelled a series of damning accusations at Elizabeth and essentially had her executed with no trial and no proof. She was simply bricked into a wall in her castle, a case of out of sight, out of mind. The nature of Bathory's execution shows us the other side of immurement. Yes, the idea of being bricked up in a chamber is terrifying, but it's also secretive, hidden from view. Domitian wished to put Cornelia to death, but he had to be careful in doing so. A bloody beheading of a once revered high priestess would have been a direct insult to the gods and would have created a flashpoint between the emperor and his people back here on Earth. Far better to let her rot silently in a hole, away from prying eyes. Similarly, Thurzó had his eyes on Bathory's vast fortune. A trial and a judicial execution would have brought unwelcome scrutiny upon the man and his motives. It served Thurzó much better to just brick her up, keep her alive for a bit, and co-opt all of that delicious wealth. This seems to have also been a common practice a little further north, around the Baltic Sea. From Olavinlinna in Finland to Visby in Sweden, and from Kuressaare in Estonia to Grobina in Latvia, there are legends of luckless knights and maidens bricked up into secret chambers within castles and stately homes. Elsewhere in Europe, immurement was specifically used on monks and members of the clergy. Witches and heretics might be brutalised upon the rack or burnt at the stake, but perhaps the idea of spilling non-heretical holy blood was too much for the authorities to stomach. In Moravia, modern-day Czechia, Duke Otto III bricked up 20 monks and their abbot in the refectory of their monastery in 1149 after one of the young monks allegedly groped the duke's wife. In Augsburg, Germany, 1409, 4 clerics accused of molesting a child were stuffed together into a small wooden casket, which was then hung in the city's 70-metre-tall Palachturm Tower. Non-clerics accused of this crime were simply burned alive. This quiet, drawn-out nature of immurement also made it perfect for erasing names from history, like at Thornton Abbey, just south of England's Humber estuary. Today, the abbey is a striking monument to the country's monastic past, but in 1722 it was the scene of a grim discovery, a hidden chamber, walled up for centuries from the outside world. Inside, a table with a book and a candlestick upon it, and besides this, a skeletal body seated in a chair. The body may be that of Walter Moulton, 14th Abbot of Thornton, executed in 1443. But the true identity of the lonely cadaver has never been confirmed. The process of immurement essentially wiped the victim from history. This process is also far from just a European phenomenon. In the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, today part of Iraq, entombed human sacrifices have been found from the 3rd millennium BC. It's thought they'd been drugged and then placed, still living, in the graves of their masters. In the 1st millennium BC, Ashurnasirpal II of Assyria was a big fan of using immurement to terrify his enemies, as well as all other manner of unsavoury techniques. To quote the man himself, "I erected a wall in front of the great gate of the city. I flayed the chiefs and covered this wall with their skins. Some of them were walled alive in the masonry. Others were impaled along the wall. I flayed a great number of them in my presence, and I clothed the wall with their skins. I collected their heads in the form of crowns, and their corpses I pierced in the shape of garlands. More recently than that, though, the practice of immurement seems to have taken place in Mongolia right into the early 20th century. While newspaper reports from the time tend to be a little sensationalised and can't always be trusted, there is a famous and rather disturbing photograph from the Mongolian plains that seems to suggest forms of immurement were practiced. But to wrap this video up, we'll cover a more recent case of immurement, and one that is truly chilling. In 1906, the shoemaker Haj Mohammed Mesfewi was convicted of murdering 36 women in Marrakesh in the Sultanate of Morocco. Mesfewi's crimes caused real public outrage in Marrakesh and across the Sultanate. This is unsurprising. The cobbler had committed unspeakable acts, drugging, decapitating and mutilating 36 victims. Moroccans were rightly appalled, and it was decided that the killer should meet a similarly horrific fate. Only no one seemed quite sure what that fate should be. Crucifixion was suggested, or burning, but pressure from the international community made this difficult. Beheading was another option, but this was deemed too quick a death for a man who had inflicted such anguish upon the young women of the community. Daily public lashings were prescribed, using a rod made from thorny acacia or shita, which tore at his flesh and drew great welts upon his back. And then finally, after weeks of this, it was time for Mesfewi to die. He was walled up alive in a Marrakesh bazaar. Chained upright in a space 2 foot square and 6 foot high, Mesfewi was taunted by Marrakesh's citizens, who pelted him with rotting meat and excrement as his living tomb was sealed. From then on, passers would jeer and yell at Mesfewi, who screamed back at them in anguish from beneath the layer of masonry. His screams continued for 2 days, growing gradually fainter, and then by the 3rd day, witnesses said that he had ceased altogether. Even in this later incarnation, immurement had achieved its grisly double purpose. The execution was carried out quietly, avoiding international opprobrium for a country walking the precarious tightrope of independence at the beginning of a new century. But, understated as it might have been, it was also very brutal, horrific enough to inflict maximum suffering, and to give outraged locals the vengeance that they craved. And for a punishment so often associated with unfair displays of power and arbitrary punishment, some would say that in this case at least, immurement was justice well served. It's March the 2nd, 1974. We're in Barcelona in Spain, and 25-year-old Salvador Puig Antic is living out his last hours on Earth. As a committed anti-fascist and an anarchist militant, Salvador has always been an enemy of Francisco Franco's regime, but when a shootout with the police resulted in the death of an officer, his fate was sealed. Now, he has to die. It's around 9 a.m. when Puig is led into the parcel room at Barcelona's La Modelo prison. Within this makeshift execution chamber is the machine that will end his life. The Garrote. His hands and feet are bound, and he's forced into a sitting position, strapped to a pole in the middle of the room. A metal collar is then fastened around his neck. A few twists of the handle at the back of the collar will do the job. His neck will be broken, his air supply will be cut off, and death will come swiftly. But there's a problem. Salvador's executioner has been drinking. At the rear of the contraption, he grapples clumsily with the handle. As the minutes tick by, Salvador remains conscious. He bucks and writhes against his constraints. The prison guards and officials observing the execution look away in disgust. It was not supposed to be like this. Those who do keep their eyes on Puig see his face changing colour. It turns a deep puce red as his blood vessels dilate. His eyes bulge, his tongue swells in his mouth. The young man's bowed hands open and close in convulsion. His chest heaves in a futile attempt to draw breath. The executioner is still working away at the handle. He twists it further and further, wondering why Salvador's neck is not yet broken. As well as tightening the collar, each twist of the handle should drive a screw into the victim's spinal column. This crushes the vertebrae and hastens death. But in his drunkenness, the executioner has not aligned the collar properly. For poor Salvador, the screw is simply driving its way into his flesh. And so this screw compounds his final agonies, rather than bringing them mercifully to an end. Finally, at 9:40 a.m., 20 minutes after the ordeal began, Salvador is pronounced dead. Around the same time, 60 miles down the coast in Tarragona, George Michael Welzel receives the same pronouncement. Together, they are the last of the anacotados. They're the last victims of the Garrote, at least in Spain. At its core, garroting was rather simple. To live, humans need air. That air has to flow down the windpipe into the lungs, and blocking the windpipe means stopping that flow of air. Stopping that flow of air means death. This simplicity is probably why garroting has been around for thousands of years. Publius Cornelius Lentulus apparently met this fate in 63 BC after the failed Catilinarian plot against Rome's consuls. 17 years later, Gallic leader Vercingetorix died in the same way, after surrendering to Julius Caesar. These early garrotings didn't involve sophisticated collars and screws. They simply used a strong cord or ligature to strangle the life from the victim. It was ultimately in Spain, though, where garroting really found its place in the judicial repertoire, both at home and abroad. The garrote became a tool of religious and political control. From 1478 onwards, the Spanish Inquisition made sure the Iberian Peninsula stayed nice and Catholic, just the way monarchs Ferdinand II and Isabella of Castile liked it. These days, of course, the Inquisition is known for its astonishing brutality and for the abject misery it inflicted on its victims. But this didn't mean that inquisitors didn't have a softer side. If heretics converted to Christianity after they'd been convicted, they were offered the gentle punishment of the garrote. This was a swift and simple way to send them off to another trial, this time before St. Peter at the pearly gates. Of course, gentle is a relative term. It's only gentle when you consider the alternative, which is being burnt alive. Thousands of miles away to the west, though, as Spanish forces got busy subjugating the peoples of South America, they brought their garrotes with them. One of the most famous indigenous victims of the garrote is the Incan ruler Atahualpa. After his capture by Francisco Pizarro, Atahualpa was offered a way to save his own life. As a ransom, he must fill one room with gold and another with silver. If he did not do this, he would die. In the end, he did do this. Both rooms were filled. But he was sentenced to death anyway. He was supposed to be burned alive, but in the end he was just garroted. Perhaps this was a thank you for providing all that loot. Atahualpa's execution mirrored the ways garrotes were used elsewhere in the world. In Qing Dynasty China, between the 17th and 20th centuries, the gongxiang, or bowstring, execution method was used to end the lives of nobles and other elites. The silk and deerhide bowstrings could be incredibly strong and were very useful for asphyxiation. They also kept the body of the condemned intact, which would ease their transition between this world and the next. Having your head chopped off, by contrast, could be a real inconvenience in the afterlife. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, garroting was also used for high-ranking prisoners, although the Ottomans weren't so bothered about keeping the body intact. Osman II was captured and imprisoned during a Janissary uprising in 1622, and then executed with the garrote. They then cut off his nose and one ear. In 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV ordered the death of Kara Mustafa after his failure at the Battle of Vienna. Though disgraced, Mustafa was still a military commander and a former Grand Vizier. It was decided that he would die a dignified death, so he was garroted with a silk scarf. Back in Spain, however, there wasn't so much concern for the class or status of the victim. By the 19th century, reforms of the penal code made capital punishment more civilized. Garroting replaced methods like beheading as the primary form of execution in Spain, and a special collar was even developed for the purpose. This made the whole thing much easier, or at least it was much easier for the executioner. The condemned person would be placed upon a stool, then strapped against a post, holding them upright and in position. The metal collar would then be fastened around their neck. The rear portion of the collar would be attached directly to the pole so that the victim could not move. A screw would then be threaded through the back of the collar and tightened with a handle. This handle was often just a long stick. Basically anything that could give the executioner a bit of leverage would do. Some variations could be more bloody, but arguably more humane. For example, executioners might attach a sharp implement to the inside of the collar, like a knife blade. This would bring about death more quickly, but likely made quite a bit of mess. By 1828, garroting was so popular that it became the only method of civilian execution in Spain. Of the 720 men and 16 women executed in Spain during the 19th century, the majority met their end with the garrote. Firing squads were used for military-related or political offences. It seems the efficiency of the Spanish method won it some fans. In 1874, garroting was even discussed in the British House of Lords as a possible alternative to hanging. Lord Dunsany related the story of half-hanged Meg, who was only discovered to be still alive while her body was being dissected. He was probably referring to Margaret Dixon, who was hanged for murder in 1721, but survived. This kind of thing was rare, but admittedly pretty horrific. Dunsany believed garroting would banish it for good, but his fellow lords didn't agree, and the practice was never adopted in Britain. Spain stopped garroting people in public in 1898, but the practice itself continued long into the 20th century. From 1900 to the eve of Civil War in 1935, 94 men and 2 women were garroted. Spain's fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, was a big fan of this execution method. 110 men and 3 women died this way between 1939 and Franco's death in 1975. But as we've seen with Salvador Puig Antich, even such a well-practiced and long-established method of execution did not always go to plan. On May 19, 1959, 31-year-old Pilar Pradas Exposito was led into a prison courtyard in Valencia and strapped into the device that would take her life. Pilar was scheduled to die at 6 a.m., but at almost 8 a.m. she was still alive. A housekeeper by trade, Pilar was convicted of poisoning her employer, Aella Pascual, but the evidence against her was based on coincidence and hearsay. In the end, it was a bottle of poison found in her possession that sealed the conviction. But this poison was common ant killer, a substance that most housekeepers would have used around the time. This meant that there was a real possibility of a pardon, so her execution was delayed by 2 hours. Pilar remained in a sort of limbo. She was not yet dead, but time was rapidly running out. To complicate matters further, her executioner was having second thoughts. Antonio Lopez Guerra, also known as Antonio Lopez Sierra, was experienced in his role. He'd arrived at 10 p.m. the previous night and set about preparing the courtyard along with the grim machinery of his trade. But then he met with the prisoner and discovered she was a woman. Antonio's professionalism melted away. In his own words, "Executing a woman is worse than executing 30 men. Having to do it with a woman is the hardest thing, especially a young girl with such pale skin like that." Pilar sensed Antonio's misgivings. Perhaps she believed she'd found a way out. Antonio remembered later. "She asked me if I had a wife, if I had a daughter. I said yes. So she asked me, why was I in such a hurry? Why did I want to kill her so much?" In fact, Antonio did not want to kill Pilar. Time and time again, he refused to go through with it. As the clock ticked down towards morning, the prison authorities appealed to Antonio's sense of civic duty, and when that failed, they leveraged his love of alcohol. The latter approach did the trick. By 8 a.m., Antonio was emboldened by a few glasses of cognac and ready to go. What's more, it was clear that the pardon was not going to appear. The morning sun streamed into the courtyard as Pilar was led out into it one final time. Looking upon the instrument of her death, she was shaken to her very core. She became increasingly desperate. "I'm very young. I don't want to be killed." It no longer mattered what Pilar did or did not want. It took 1.5 turns of the handle for Antonio to end her life. No family members or friends came to collect her remains. Pilar Prades Exposito was the last woman to die by the garrote in Spain, but the process would continue for 15 more years until it ended with the executions of Salvador Puig Antich and George Michael Welzel in March 1974. The trauma of the Exposito execution had obviously not affected Antonio Lopez too badly. He was back in the hot seat in 1974 and was ready to botch the execution of Salvador Puig Antich. Ironically, once again, due to his fondness for alcohol. Outwardly, the agonized end of Puig Antich didn't bother Lopez much either. After all, Lopez was an avowed fascist who'd fought for Franco in the Civil War and then volunteered with the German Blue Division to fight the Soviets in World War II. What was one more dead anti-fascist to him? Inwardly, though, he may have been feeling the strain. Even this loyal servant of the regime needed a bit of booze to get the job done. And in fact, this was not unusual for Lopez, as his son Candido remembered in 2011. My father gave the impression that he was a tough guy, but I can assure you that when he came back from executing somebody, he was always drunk. Perhaps the brutality of the death penalty isn't just inflicted on the victims who suffer it, but also in the fact that it makes monsters of men, or gives monstrous men a handsome living. It's May the 4th, 1990. We're in Florida State Prison. 43-year-old Jesse Tefero is preparing to walk to his death. He doesn't have to walk very far. It's only 30 feet from his cell door to the death chamber. On entry, he nods a greeting to the men and women in the observation room, those tasked with watching him die. Tefero is strapped into the electric chair. Electrodes are attached to his head and leg. To increase conductivity, a wet sponge sits between the electrode and Tefero's shaved cranium. He offers his last words, something about the arbitrary and capricious nature of the death penalty. And then the hood is placed over his head, extinguishing the light for the last time. The chamber is almost silent. The scribbling of the reporters is the only sound, until the executioner flips the switch. Harry Keller of the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel described it as a loud throb of a jolt. That would be the sound of the electricity coursing through the body of Jesse Tefero. Tefero's body tenses as the current arcs through it. His chest heaves, his joints tighten. Then, to the horror of the observers, a jet of flame erupts from the top of his head. Tefero's hood is burning, and his head beneath the hood is burning too. A grim smell fills the chamber, the smell of a man being cooked. That smell lingers as the team shuts off the power, but they know it's not been enough. There are faint signs of life from the condemned man. His body is seen to move. The sounds of laboured breathing rattle from his chest. Twice more they run the current through Jesse Tefero. His body writhes and squirms against the power tearing through it. There are no more flames. 7 minutes after the process began, he's pronounced dead. The reporters in the observation room can't quite believe what they've just seen, and so they launch into questions. Is this normal? Do people usually burst into flames like that? No, is the response. It's not normal. People aren't supposed to literally combust in the chair. And at the investigation, they find what had gone wrong. The culprit, it's decided, was the sponge. The sponge was supposed to be organic, supposed to be a sea sponge which conducts electricity through its moisture. The shock then goes directly to the brain, hastening death for the victim. But because the executioners used a synthetic sponge, this didn't happen. The sponge boiled, dried, and then burst into flames. Without a direct connection to the brain, Jesse's death became a grim and drawn-out nightmare. But while the sponge incident was an anomaly, what happened to Tefero was actually not unusual for people facing the electric chair. See, when the switch was flipped, Jesse Tefero received 2,000 volts of electricity. At this voltage, electricity generates incredible amounts of heat, causing severe burns in the head where the current enters, and the leg where it exits. Everything in between, all the tissues, organs, sinews and muscles are also cooked as temperatures reach 100 degrees Celsius. This is quite literally enough to boil the body. Beneath the hood, Jesse Tefero's eyeballs would have begun to melt in their sockets. Across his body, Tefero's blood vessels expanded and ruptured, and the massive internal bleeding caused swelling and discoloration. On examination, his bruised, distended body bore the grim marks of its torture. The current also triggered muscles, sending them into spasm. This was the cause of the writhing that the observers saw. In some cases, these spasms might be enough to tear sinews, dislocate joints, and even break bones. The shock may also trigger involuntary bodily functions, such as urination, defecation, or vomiting up bile and blood. The products of these functions will cook along with the condemned, contributing to the vile smell within the chamber. When death finally arrives, it is usually delivered either by brain damage or cardiac arrest. And while all this sounds pretty horrifying, it's actually standard checklist for an execution by the electric chair. The only unusual elements of the Tefero execution were the 6-inch tongues of flame erupting from his head, and the fact that it took him 3 blasts of electricity to finish him off, rather than the usual 2. Regardless of whether it goes to plan or not, riding the lightning is a barbaric way to end a life. Now, not everyone has a problem with this barbarity. You may wish to point out that in all this graphic depiction of Tefero's end, we've not even touched on what brought him here in the first place. So let's take a closer look at Jesse Tefero's criminal history. Tefero was born in New Jersey in 1946. In 1967, aged only 20 years old, he and an accomplice robbed 2 women, then kept them prisoner for 11 hours while violating them repeatedly. He was convicted on several different charges. One of the charges was crime against nature, referring to the manner in which he assaulted the women. While he got 25 years for these crimes, he didn't actually serve them. He made parole in 1974, but had been out for less than 2 years when he was back in trouble again. While sleeping in his car, along with his wife Sonia Jacobs, their 2 children, and a friend named Walter Rhodes, Tefero was approached by 2 police officers. Various stories circulated as to what exactly happened next. All that's known for sure is that a taser and a gun were discharged, and both police officers were shot dead. Judge Daniel Fudge, known as Maximum Dan due to his penchant for heavy penalties, sentenced both Tefero and Jacobs to death. Jacobs' sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. Tefero, with his criminal history, received no such leniency and went to the chair in 1990. Jesse Tefero was not, in any case, a pleasant individual. It could be argued convincingly that his death in May 1990 was of little loss to society. It could also be argued that Tefero showed no compassion to the women he subjected to life-changing torment for 11 hours, nor to the family members of the police officers that he killed, and therefore no compassion should have been shown to him. But that's not really the point. The point is that the justice system is supposed to serve society as a whole, and not supposed to be a simple tool of punitive retribution. It's not supposed to inflict maximum suffering on people who, quote-unquote, deserve it. Instead, if this form of punishment is to be used at all, it must be a mechanism for making society a safer place. So, does the savage and surreal process of the electric chair actually make us safer? And could it actually benefit society? Before we answer this, let's find out how we even began using the electric chair in the first place. And of course, I say we in the broader sense, because unless you're American or Filipino, then your nation has never sent anyone to the chair at all. These are the only 2 nations who have ever adopted this macabre technology. As we get further into the history of the electric chair, it will become clear why most nations have steered well clear of it. The electric chair first emerged in late 19th century America, when newspaper readers across the country became rapt by a new phenomenon. This new phenomenon was the high-voltage lightning that was now brightening streets and workplaces right across the United States. But even more interesting to the newspaper-buying public was this. What happens when the new technology goes wrong? As it turned out, that same system that provided a nice fuzzy glow at night could be pretty lethal if you messed around with it. Newspapers began to fill with stories of people who didn't treat the high voltage lines with the appropriate respect and were struck down dead as a result. One of those people was George Lamuel Smith, a dock worker from Buffalo, New York. In 1881, he suffered a mild electric shock when he touched the guardrail of a lighting powerhouse. Evidently, Smith quite enjoyed his shocking experience, and after a drinking session that August, he returned to the powerhouse, broke in and grabbed hold of 2 connections on an electric dynamo, keen to repeat his previous adventure. This time, however, there was no fun to be had. He received a massive shock and was killed instantly. Although Smith's story is a comical example of winning a Darwin Award, it's also a tragic reminder of the dangers of electricity. But for men of science, at the twilight of the 19th century, this sudden death was a fascinating case. Alfred P. Southwick, who was a dentist but also enjoyed a bit of science and engineering on the side, had an idea. If high-voltage electric current could kill someone like Smith so quickly and so cleanly, then surely it could be used on condemned criminals too. Southwick never actually tested his idea on actual humans. That would have been insane. Instead, he did the reasonable thing and put hundreds of stray dogs to death, all in the name of science and progress. By 1886, capital punishment was becoming a contentious issue in the USA. A stream of gaudy stories about botched executions was turning American stomachs. There were hangings that dropped too short and left the condemned squirming at the end of their rope, and then hangings that dropped too long, resulting in messy decapitation. And there was even a bizarre incident at the Utah firing squad in which an unrestrained and unblindfolded prisoner was able to leap from his seat as he was struck. All the bullets missed his heart, and as a result, he took 27 minutes to die. Even in the late 19th century, this all seemed a bit too much, and there was a real danger that the whole capital punishment thing might be abolished. The authorities were keen to make sure that this didn't happen, so they sought a new method. The Gerry Commission was set up, headed by human rights advocate Elbridge Gerry, along with lawyer and politician Matthew Hale and Southwick himself. A revised method of the firing squad was considered, but it would result in further tarnishing the arms industry. Not ideal for 19th century America. The guillotine was also passed around, but its association with the bloodshed of the French Revolution felt like a depressing step backwards. After some debate, Southwick and the others on the commission gave their recommendation in 1888. What was suggested was the electric chair, a wooden seat hooked up to a circuit into which the condemned was placed, restrained, and then shocked until they were dead. But the argument was far from over. Such a device needed a current, and for this there were 2 options. There was alternating current, or AC, developed by George Westinghouse, or there was direct current, DC, developed by Thomas Edison. This is where things took something of a bizarre turn. As Edison's people attempted to discredit Westinghouse in what would become known as the War of the Currents, they demonstrated how an AC shock could be fatal. If you're wondering how they did this, they shocked a horse to death. Again, science and progress. But for judicial authorities, a fatal shock was not something to be scared of. Instead, it was exactly what they were looking for. So when William Kemmler was slated to die in 1890, it was decided he would be the first to meet his end in the electric chair, and Westinghouse's AC would do the honours. George Westinghouse was, of course, horrified by this. Consumers across America were already disturbed by the lethal power of electricity, and an association with a grim new form of capital punishment would be professional suicide. So Westinghouse became personally involved in Kemmler's appeal, even hiring the prestigious attorney William Burke Cochrane to handle the case. The defence argued that the experimental method represented cruel and unusual punishment and was therefore unconstitutional. But even with Cochrane on side, the appeal failed. Kemmler went to the death chamber at New York's Auburn prison on August 6th. The judge had decided that there was nothing cruel or unusual about the process. History would beg to differ. Kemmler had been charged with the murder of his partner, Tilly Ziegler, the previous year, killing her in a rage after a heated argument. As this seemed to be a crime of passion, at first it looked like he might actually escape the chair. But it transpired that Kemmler had left the property following the argument, gone to fetch an axe from a nearby barn, and then returned to the house and struck Ziegler multiple times in cold blood. The verdict was first-degree murder, and Kemmler was going to die for this. Early on the morning of August 6th, a smartly dressed Kemmler was strapped quietly into his chair, telling his executioners, "Take it easy and do it properly. I'm in no hurry." Then they flicked the switch. For 17 seconds, 1,000 volts passed through William Kemmler. This was the voltage they'd used to kill yet another horse a few days before while testing the chair. Surely, all of this was enough. As it turned out, it wasn't enough. One of the attending physicians declared Kemmler dead. Witnesses questioned this, asking if he was dead, then why was he still breathing? The generator was charged again, and as Kemmler sat there in a sort of grisly limbo between life and death, the next dose was administered. A 2,000-volt current was passed through him, twice the voltage of the first time. Now the body began to cook. As the New York Times reported, an awful odour began to permeate the death chamber. Then, as though to cap the climax of this fearful sight, it was seen that the hair under and around the electrode on the head, and the flesh under and around the electrode at the base of the spine, was singeing. The stench was unbearable. It took 8 minutes to kill William Kemmler. Westinghouse remarked, "They would have done better using an axe." So this new and supposedly humane method made its debut with a scene of utmost barbarity. Surely the experiment had failed. The electric chair was not the way to go. Well, state and federal legislators didn't agree. They seemed very taken with the idea of the electric chair, despite the disturbing demise of William Kemmler. Over the next 2 decades, first Ohio, then Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Virginia had adopted the electric chair. In time, 26 states, or more than half of the Union, would pick this method. In 1899, New York's Sing Sing prison had the dubious distinction of electrocuting the first woman when Martha Place was executed for the killing of her stepdaughter. 2 years later, the assassin of President McKinley, Leon Czolgosz, was executed by electrocution at Auburn prison. The electric chair was now becoming the go-to method for execution in the United States. And of course, the botched executions kept on coming. In 1946, Willie Francis shocked observers when he began to cry out during his execution in Louisiana. As the current surged through him, Francis yelled, "Take it off, take it off, let me breathe." The executioner apparently replied, "You're not supposed to breathe, boy." He then ran the current for another 30 seconds before realizing something was wrong. The current was shut off, and Francis was released from his straps. It was found that Louisiana's famous portable electric chair, Gruesome Gertie, had not been set up correctly by the prison guards, possibly due to drunkenness. Francis was severely injured, but did survive. The fact that he had already undergone the execution process was used in his subsequent appeal, but this was ultimately rejected. Willie Francis returned to the electric chair on May 9th, 1947. This time he didn't survive. He was 18 years old. And to make matters worse, recent investigations have cast real doubt on Francis's conviction. It seems the teenager who faced the electric chair twice may not have been guilty at all. Several years after the sad case of Willie Francis, America was gripped by the so-called trial of the century, as married couple Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of passing military secrets to the Soviet Union. Despite protests from home and abroad, the couple were found guilty and sentenced to death. They would face the electric chair on June 19th, 1953. Julius died quickly. He was pronounced dead after just one electric shock. For Ethel, however, the process was rather lengthier. She was shocked 3 times. Then, as she was examined, it was found that her heart was still beating, so she was shocked a 4th time, then a 5th. Witnesses said they saw a plume of smoke rising from her head as it writhed beneath the hood. Finally, she followed her husband into death. Yet again, the unreliability of this supposedly infallible method was clear to see. All these botched attempts at execution did not go unnoticed, and in 1972, 82 years after Kemmler's execution, the Furman versus Georgia case found that capital punishment, in its current form, violated the 8th Amendment. In other words, it was cruel and unusual punishment, which was what Kemmler's attorneys had said in the first place. Rather than bring about an end to executions in the USA, Furman v. Georgia led to a set of legal compromises by which state and federal judiciaries attempted to develop acceptable procedures for the death penalty. Many of these were upheld by the Supreme Court, effectively giving the green flag for more executions from 1977 onwards. This meant more executions by electric chair and, of course, more botched executions as a result. When Frank Coppola was executed for murder in 1982, he went voluntarily to the chamber. He'd stated that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life rotting in prison and wanted to spare his family any more anguish. While no media witnessed the execution, one of Coppola's attorneys stated that it took 2 shocks to kill the condemned and that there was a strong odour and the, quote, sizzling sound of burning flesh. The death chamber, allegedly filled with smoke and flames, was seen close to the electrodes on the man's head and leg. John Louis Evans met a similar fate in Alabama the following year. Evans' attorney described how a 30-second jolt of electricity caused the condemned's body to slam against the restraints, damaging the mechanism. The electrode burst from the strap holding it in place. A large puff of greyish smoke and sparks poured out from under the hood that covered Mr. Evans' face. An overpowering stench of burnt flesh and clothing began pervading the witness room. 2 doctors examined Mr. Evans and declared that he was not dead. A second blast of electricity was administered. Once again, the heart was still beating. A 3rd shock was applied, and finally, Evans was pronounced dead. It had taken him 24 minutes to die. In 1985, William Earl Vandiver's 17-minute execution in Indiana was described as outrageous by a lawyer in attendance due to the smell of burning and smoke emitting from the condemned. 5 years later in Virginia, witnesses reported that blood erupted from Wilbert Evans' nose, mouth and eyes during his electrocution. The prison chaplain would say that the process amounted to torture. In 1999, Alan Lee Davis also bled profusely from his nose during his own execution, causing yet more controversy. The Davis case may have been the final straw, at least as far as Florida was concerned. To date, he's the last person to be executed by electric chair in the state, although condemned inmates can opt for this method at their own discretion. This is reflected across most other states too. Of the 26 that have used the electric chair as a method of execution, only 7 are still using it. None of these 7 use it as their primary method. The most recent person to die by the electric chair was Nicholas Todd Sutton, who chose this method over the lethal injection and was put to death in Tennessee in 2020. The only other nation to use the electric chair, the Philippines, hasn't actually electrocuted anyone since 1976. Even once staunch supporters of the electric chair have, it seems, grown tired of its brutality. After this brief run-through of the history of the electric chair, let's return to our earlier question. Does it actually serve society? And by basically every metric, it doesn't. It inflicts incredible violence upon those who must die by this method. It brutalizes the condemned, and also brutalizes those who must inflict and observe its punishment. In a nation like the USA, in which the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment is enshrined in the very Constitution, it's about as cruel and unusual as you can get. It also creates flashpoints between the state and the people. Each botched execution, and as we've seen, there have been a lot of these botched executions, creates a media firestorm. And these firestorms tend to get so hot that the families of the victims get forgotten. Their plight is sidelined by the grim spectacle of the chair. Some would argue that all of this can be forgiven if it makes us all safer. But the electric chair doesn't even do that. To take Florida as an example, the state experienced almost 15 murders per 100,000 people in 1981 when the electric chair was in use, and maintained a level above 11 per 100,000 for the remainder of the decade. Removing the electric chair as the primary execution method in 2000 did not result in any meaningful spike in murders. In fact, the murder rate fell in 2000 and then again in 2005. Other than the period of 2006 to 2008, Florida's murder rate remained between 4.9 and 5.5 per 100,000 people for each year ever since. So if we're not meaningfully deterring murders with the chair, and we're not supporting a healthier, more stable society, what are we doing? It seems we're propagating a myth that began over 135 years ago. The myth that the electric chair is a clean, safe, and humane way to end a life. Straight away, the horrific execution of William Kemmler in 1890 proved this myth to be false, and advocates for the chair have been trying to make up for the Kemmler fiasco ever since. All of this controversy led to the US adopting a new method to dispatch those who were deemed unfit to continue living: the lethal injection. But if you watch my video on how that actually works, you'll find that, like the chair, it comes with its own set of complications and ethical grey areas. It's 72 BC. We're at Ariminum on the northeast coast of the Italian peninsula. The legate Mummius senses an opportunity for a swift victory. Maneuvering his legions behind the rebel force commanded by Spartacus, Mummius is under strict orders. He must not attack. And yet, Spartacus seems to be there for the taking. Easy business. For Mummius, the temptation is just too great. He leaps into action, driving his legions forward into the rebels. It's a disaster. Many of the escaped slaves fighting under Spartacus are highly trained. Some are even former gladiators, quite skilled in hand-to-hand combat. And what's more, they're fighting for their freedom. They overpower Mummius and his two legions with some ease. It quickly becomes a full-on rout as terrified legionnaires flee the battlefield. Mummius has woefully underestimated Spartacus's men. It's an embarrassing defeat. And the overall Roman commander, Marcus Licinius Crassus, does not like embarrassing defeats. Mummius and his men, therefore, must be punished for their failure. To execute this punishment, Crassus calls on a method from the early days of the Roman Republic, the method known today as decimation. Mummius's soldiers are hauled before the rest of the army. A military tribune presents their lists of crimes: cowardice, ill discipline, poor soldiering, all things that are unacceptable for Roman soldiers. Now Crassus himself steps forward. He reprimands Mummius and his men and reminds them of what is at stake. Spartacus's slave rebellion threatens the integrity of the Roman Republic. It even threatens its very existence. Rome depends on legions to keep them safe, and if the legions fall, then Rome falls with it. From each offending cohort of troops, the name of every soldier is placed into an upturned helmet, and the ceremony begins. 8 names are drawn for each century of roughly 80 men. All of the faltering soldiers are being punished, but that punishment is shared collectively across the ranks. For the crimes of the unit, 10% of its men will die. As the tribune passes each cohort, the legionnaires squeeze their eyes tightly shut, their lips twitch in silent prayer, offering supplications to whichever god might save them. They plead with the hand of fate to pass them over and to give them another chance. Nonetheless, names are read out, and the unfortunate men are led to the front of the cohort. Those who remain behind are relieved. They're sorry to see their comrades go, but they're also happy that it's not them this time. The named men kneel, then the swoop of an axe brings their lives to an end. As the heads roll into the dust, the others watch on. The lesson has been learned. Cowardice, impatience, or an unwillingness to follow orders will not be tolerated. When one legionnaire falters, all are put at risk. Mummius is humiliated. His forces are reduced by 10%, but he will escape with his life, as will the remaining men. But they won't escape punishment altogether. Writing of another decimation, the historian Plutarch tells of surviving soldiers who were placed on barley rations rather than the standard wheat given to the legions. They were also forced to bivouac outside the main camp. In other words, they were made examples of. This way, other troops understood what was expected of them, and they also understood what would come to them if they didn't meet these expectations. What we're dealing with here is one of the most famous Roman punishments: decimation. The first mention of decimation comes from Livy, who describes how the punishment was used by Appius Claudius Crassus Sabinus in 471 BC. After his troops rebelled against him in a campaign against the Aquii and the Volsci tribes, the consul had every 10th rebel executed. At least, that's how Livy tells it. The 471 BC decimation may never have actually happened. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that the punishment was never really used at all, at least in the early centuries of the Roman Republic. Polybius describes the decimation in quite a lot of detail, and his account seems to align with the later accounts from Plutarch and other historians like Frontinus. So it seems at least that the concept of decimation was real, but there are few reliable descriptions of it actually being used. And this is quite unusual for Roman punishments. You see, the sources for punishments of this period are actually fairly good. The fact that decimation only gets a few descriptive mentions suggests that it was more of a threat rather than something that was happening regularly. By the 1st century BC, however, that seems to have changed. Decimation leaps beyond the realms of rhetoric and metaphor and becomes something very real. Roman generals of the 1st century BC were keen to instill some good old-fashioned discipline into their troops, even if that discipline was based on spurious historical record. Crassus was one such general, a big fan of the traditional values of the early Republic. Crassus unleashed decimation on Mummius and his legions during the Third Servile War. In some ways, this isn't all that surprising. For all the "I'm Spartacus" banter that has emerged in recent years, the Third Servile War of 73 to 71 BC was a serious issue and a genuine threat to Rome. Spartacus's slave revolt could have been the end of the Republic. At the Battle of Mount Vesuvius in 73 BC, Spartacus's 70 gladiators utilized guerrilla tactics to outsmart and defeat 3,000 Roman militia, and may have killed their commander, Gaius Claudius Glaber. Crassus, therefore, needed his legions to stand firm, and so there was no room for mercy. Decimation may have been odd and antiquated, but it certainly got the message across. Some accounts say that he killed 4,000 men in this manner, but this is almost certainly an exaggeration. It doesn't make sense for Crassus to cripple the fighting capability of his legions like this, especially not in the middle of an existential crisis like Spartacus's uprising. Instead, historians believe around 50 men were put to death in this way, which meant Crassus could still have wielded the remaining soldiers in battle. This seems to be a theme of decimations. Kill enough people to send a message, but don't destroy the unit as a fighting force. When Julius Caesar punished a mutiny in 49 BC, for example, he used decimation, but this probably involved killing just 12 people. Mark Antony may have also deployed this method 5 years later, but Cicero's account of this suggests he executed specifically chosen individuals rather than random soldiers. And if this is true, it doesn't really count as a decimation, regardless of the number of victims. According to Plutarch, though, Mark Antony did indeed use the technique in 39 BC after a defeat on his Parthian campaign. By the historian's account, quote, Antony visited those who had played the coward with what is called decimation. That is, he divided the whole number of them into tens and put to death that one from each 10 upon who the lot fell. For the rest, he ordered rations of barley instead of wheat. But were these punishments actually effective? Well, Crassus did eventually put down Spartacus's rebellion, so could he have done it without decimating Mummius's legions? We think he probably could have. And Mark Antony was ultimately successful in his Parthian campaign, but how pivotal was his violent show of strength against a defeated legion? Probably not that pivotal. In reality, this kind of violent retribution on a military unit that faltered in battle probably wasn't very effective. Roman armies won campaigns because of their tactics, training, and equipment, not because of ostentatious punishments. In fact, decimation could sometimes make matters worse. It could lead to mutiny from soldiers who were appalled with the idea of putting their fellow warriors to death. The historian G.R. Watson says, the army might be prepared to assist in the execution of innocent slaves, but professional soldiers could hardly be expected to cooperate in the indiscriminate execution of their own comrades. This is probably why actual documented instances of decimation are so few and far between. Octavian may have carried out a decimation in 34 BC, and Lucius Apronius may have done the same in 19 AD, but in total, there are only around 12 confirmed instances of this punishment. Years later, Emperor Macrinus tried to adopt a slightly gentler version of decimation. This was centesimatio, or the execution of every 100th man instead of every 10th. But this didn't really catch on. So, as an actual Roman punishment, decimation was pretty rare and likely not very effective. As a rhetorical tool, however, it may have been very effective indeed. The threat of decimation alone might have been enough to keep Roman legions in line. It might have also helped instill a sense of mutual reliance and comradeship within legions. Each legionnaire understood that they could be punished for the cowardice of their fellow soldier and vice versa. It's this rhetorical power that has kept the idea of decimation alive through the ages. At the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, more than 12,000 years after the Visigoths sacked Rome, decimation suddenly had an unexpected revival. This battle was notorious for its heavy casualties, as the Holy Roman and Swedish empires fought one of the pivotal clashes of the 30 Years' War. It became a Pyrrhic victory for the Swedish after King Gustavus Adolphus lost his life. For one regiment of Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim's corps, the heat of battle was too much. The regiment broke and fled and was subsequently found guilty of cowardice. After a series of executions, the remaining soldiers were decimated. 10% of the troops were hanged, while the remaining 90% were subject to ritual humiliations and beatings. The idea here was not simply to punish a fighting force, but to remove the force from the army altogether. There were similar scenes after the Swedish and Holy Roman Empires clashed once again at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1642, when Colonel Madlow's cavalry was said to have fled before a blow had even been struck. Madlow's troops were court-martialed and humiliated. 6 regiments that had performed admirably in the battle were given the honour of surrounding Madlow's sorry men. As insults were hurled upon them, their regimental colours were torn apart. Next, a series of dice rolls were used to select 90 men from the regiment. The officers among the condemned men were beheaded. The rest were hanged, their bodies displayed on the road between Rokycany and Lidolevi, serving as macabre warnings to anyone doubting the rigid discipline of the Holy Roman Empire. More recently, decimation was used in the First World War, as commanders desperately tried to maintain discipline amid the horror of industrial conflict. Luigi Cardona, the Italian commander-in-chief, was known as a tough disciplinarian, so it's no surprise he was a staunch advocate of decimation. The tactic was used at least 5 times by Italian forces during the war, including an incident in which 12 men were chosen at random from a fleeing unit and then shot in May 1916. As the war became increasingly dire for the Italians, Cardona tried to use decimation to bring rebellions under control. On July 16, 1917, 28 men of the 142nd Regiment were selected by the drawing of lots and then executed after a mutiny. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Caporetto and the subsequent chaotic retreat in the face of the Austro-Hungarian advance, Cardona was sacked from his post. Cardona's legacy is complex. For some, he's a symbol of military incompetence and almost lost Italy the war. For others, he was a misunderstood tactician, struggling to adapt to the rigours of Alpine warfare. These dissenting voices tend to agree to one thing, however, that he was extremely cruel to his men. And this cruelty was often ineffective. For years, the Austro-Hungarians fought the Italians to a bloody stalemate on the Isonzo River before the Italian line finally broke at Caporetto. Armando Diaz, who succeeded Cardona as chief of staff, rejected his predecessor's cruel discipline. It was Diaz who oversaw the Italian victory in 1918 without decimating his troops in the process. But the Italians weren't the only proponents of decimation. The Russians didn't outlaw the practice until 1920, and there are reports of decimation used during the Battle of Teruel in the Spanish Civil War in 1938. Today, of course, the word decimation has taken on a whole different meaning. We take it to mean something like annihilation, the complete and utter destruction of a military unit or another entity. In fact, decimation was nothing like this. It was utilised as a symbolic punishment and was intended to instill a collective identity onto the unit in question, showing that comrades won and lost together and took responsibility for one another. It might seem rather unfair to execute 10% of a unit at random, rather than punishing individual acts of cowardice, but this randomness was part of its power. Roman armies weren't interested in individual valour or ingenuity. Their power was their unity and uniformity, and so this was how punishments were applied too. The punishment was also an incentive to keep on fighting, even when things looked hopeless. As the historian Louis Rawlings has pointed out regarding the Battle of Cannae, defeated armies of the period would typically experience a casualty rate of around 10%. Precisely the casualty rate you'd experience during a decimation. In circumstances like those, you might as well fight on. At least that way, your survival is in your own hands, rather than in the hands of fate. But as we've seen, threatening decimation was often more effective than actually carrying it out. There's very little point in killing 10% of your own troops at random, even if they have let you down in battle. This is probably why the practice was only used a dozen or so times, even over centuries of Roman military history. In more recent years, however, some commanders have used decimation in a slightly different flavour. They've used it as punishment for enemy troops, rather than their own. And that brings us to our final tale, which comes from the Finnish Civil War in 1918. When the Finnish White Army surrounded a poorly armed contingent of the socialist Finnish Red Army in February 1918, there was only likely to be one winner. Still, the Reds held out for 2 days, despite not even having enough guns to go around. When they finally ran out of ammo, some 700 Reds emerged from the mill building they'd been holed up in with their hands in the air. What followed has become known as the Lottery of Huruslahti. Men were plucked at random from the surrendered column and then lined up on the ice of the frozen lake Huruslahti. By this point, the Reds could expect no mercy. The shoot-on-the-spot declaration had already been made by the White leader, Karl Mannerheim. Anyone who had taken up arms against the Whites must be shot. The Reds wouldn't even have had enough guns for each man to hold one at the same time, but few could argue that they had taken up arms, at least in spirit. The shots would have made a spine-tingling sound as they rang out across the frozen lake. One by one, the unlucky Red soldiers fell to their knees on the ice, the stark contrast of their blood on the snow offering a final gory reminder of the Red versus White struggle. Some accounts say that 80 soldiers were executed in this way. The survivors of Varus had been decimated. The defeat was complete. There are some practical aspects to this punishment. The Whites wanted to send a message they were not to be messed with. Captured Reds may be put to death, cruelly and seemingly at random. By killing 1 in every 10, or by some accounts 1 in every 7, they could send out their message whilst also saving resources. The process was devastating for the Reds, killing a large number of their men and breaking the spirit of the survivors, and the Whites had achieved this without expending too much ammunition. More recently, though, many have disputed the events on the ice at Huruslahti. The men were certainly executed, but perhaps not at random. Historians believe they may have been selected according to their status as leaders and social activists. It wasn't a true decimation at all. It was just a mass execution of surrendered soldiers. This is where the rhetorical and symbolic power of decimation raises its grim head yet again. By allowing their enemy to believe a decimation had taken place, the White Finns had drawn upon the language and methodology of ancient Rome to send a message to the Reds. And by dressing up the slaughter in the trappings of a millennia-old martial punishment, they may have made it easier to pretend that mass killing was something noble and respectable, rather than what it was, a war crime. It's sometime in 1589. We're in a darkly lit chamber in Cologne, where a man named Peter Stump is currently doing a stint on the rack. As bad as it may be, though, the man currently being pulled limb from limb will soon go on to endure something far worse: being broken on the wheel. See, the local population have recently been terrorised by a series of disappearances, and to add to the paranoia, a considerable number of livestock have been snatched away in the night, only for the shepherds to find their skeletal remains far away from the safety of their pastures. The whole ordeal has got the people of Cologne in a bit of a panic, but to their enduring relief, the authorities are certain that they found the man responsible. Well, to be precise, they found the wolf, Mr. Peter Stump. He stands accused of colluding with evil forces, of being a cannibal, a bloodsucker, and most crucially, a werewolf, responsible for terrorising the local people with savage murders, disappearances, the butchering of livestock, and even the eating of his own son. After a few cranks on the lever, the rack starts doing its job, and tendons and joints are stretched to their breaking point. Mr. Stump is left with no option but to confess. But the story he gives absolutely baffles the magistrates. He says that he's been given a belt by Satan, and that whenever he wears it, he transforms into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body, and mighty paws. It's a bizarre admission, but with a few more cranks on the rack, he'll continue to accept guilt for whatever supposed crimes his torturers go on to throw at him. The interrogation had been very successful, and by the end of the session, Mr. Stump will go on to confess to a list of crimes that are long enough to fill a pamphlet, including, but not limited to, an insatiable bloodlust for live goats and sheep, the abduction and consumption of 14 children and 2 women, the eating of fetuses torn fresh from their mothers' wombs, the eating of the brain of his own son, an incestuous coupling with his own daughter named Sybil, and another round of unholy intercourse, this time not with a family member, but with a succubus sent to him by none other than the devil. For the magistrates of Cologne, this receipt of wrongdoing is all they need to push for the harshest recriminations possible. Peter Stump was a werewolf, and was about to experience the full weight of God's law. And so on the 31st of October 1589, Mr. Stump was put to death via the breaking wheel. In the particular case of Stump, the details aren't that well recorded, but we know enough about the wheel to know it was bad news indeed, because it was a feature of Crime and Punishment at the time. In the Schauspiel, an important legal document compiled during the period of the Holy Roman Empire, the breaking wheel is set out as the go-to sentence for crimes like murder, since it serves as a mirror punishment to the crime. Mirror punishments are a bit like lex talionis, in that they're supposed to be reflective of the crime committed. But instead of being proportional, like the talionis, i.e. an eye for an eye, they're instead closer to poetic justice, meaning that the punishment's resemblance to the crime comes first, but the severity of the recrimination can either be milder than the crime or far, far more extreme. In the case of Peter Stump, it would take its most extreme form. The ordeal started by having Stump tied to the side of a large wheel, which laid horizontally on the ground, with arms and legs fully extended into a spread eagle position. Once he was fully restrained, the wheel was then pushed upright so that he was kind of crucified against the spokes and completely immobile. At this stage, the executioner would take red-hot pincers that had been waiting in a lit brazier, and with a slow and methodical pace, the pincers would grip chunks of the flesh before the executioner twisted the handle and stripped the gobs of skin and fat away with a violent tug. He was said to have endured this procedure on 10 different spots on the torso before it was then applied to his arms and legs. This would have taken at least an hour, and let's bear in mind that the process hadn't even properly begun yet. This was just the prelude. Next up, it would be time for him to be actually broken, hence the name, the breaking wheel. How the breaking actually happens depends on the particular whims of the executioner and the time and place that it occurs, but in either case, the result is the same. Both of the legs and both of the arms are smashed to pieces, utterly broken. In some cases, this could actually be done before the victim was tied to the spokes, and the executioner would instead pick up the wheel and raise it over his head before driving it down to crunch through the kneecaps, elbows, shins, wrists, forearms, and feet of the victim below. Oftentimes, this would be a slow and clumsy process as the executioner stopped to gather his strength between each of the crushing blows, lifting the heavy wheel above his head over and over before slamming it back down onto the victim. This would then end in one of two ways. If mercy was to be granted, the wheel would be slammed onto the chest and ribs of the victim, destroying lung function and causing death by asphyxiation. Or it could be dropped onto the neck and head as a coup de grace, a much faster, but still quite brutal end, via blunt force trauma. If mercy was not granted, however, then the victim's mangled body would be scooped back up onto the wheel before their broken limbs would be wrapped around the spools. These mangled arms and legs would often require an encouraging shove, accompanied by more gut-wrenching snaps from the shattered skeleton, in order to actually get these limbs into position, and predictably, it would allow the sharp edges of broken bones to pierce their way through flesh and skin. Horrific as it was, though, this was the more typical method, and the one detailed in the Zürcher Blutgerichtsordnung, or the Zurich Blood Court Ordinance. For Peter Stump, though, proceedings would take a slightly different flavour. Rather than using the wheel as a hammer by which to crush the vulnerable limbs, it was instead used as an anvil to secure him into place as he absorbed one blow after another to his shins, ankles, thighs, biceps, shoulders, elbows, and wrists. The blows were delivered by the blunt side of an axe, swung one strike at a time with sickening precision and brutal force. When finally shattered, the limbs were untied, wrapped around the spools in unnatural positions, and tied once again, leaving him no longer resembling a person, but instead an agonized torso, fastened in place like a human pretzel, surrounded by mutilated limbs. At this stage, typical procedure would then be to mount the whole display onto a pole so that the crucified wretch would be left to dangle, half alive and wholly broken before the audience, to die finally by exposure, whilst being picked apart by hungry buzzards, grateful for a fresh meal stripped away from living flesh. This was supposedly what happened in the case of the semi-mythical serial killer Christman Genipatenga, who was found guilty of the murder of nearly 1,000 victims over a 13-year killing spree, and as a result was subjected to the wheel in 1581. He was said to have endured 9 days while hanging, with passers-by coming to offer him strong drinks in order to prolong Christman's suffering as the life slowly ebbs from his mangled body. For Stump, however, there was to be an act of mercy, if you could call it that. Once he had been reapplied to the wheel in his broken condition, the executioner then took a sword to his neck and lopped his head clean from his body in a single stroke. With this, Stump was now dead and free from his suffering. It's worth mentioning that he did not, at any point, shapeshift into a werewolf in order to overpower his tormentors and make an escape. despite being found guilty beyond doubt of having this satanic power. Dead and innocent as he may be, though, this was not the end of the horror show. His headless body, still attached to the breaking wheel, was then placed over a fire, and his daughter Sybil was thrown onto the flames with him for the accusation of having had an incestuous relationship with her father, something for which they only received a confession after the duress of torture. It was also reported that by the time Sybil was actually thrown onto the roaring flames of her father's corpse, she'd already been flayed alive, a process which, if you've watched my video on, is unimaginably cruel, and I'll leave you to picture the screams of the young girl forced to endure the already horrific process of being roasted alive, just this time without the protection of her own skin. As far as the authorities were concerned, however, justice had been served, and the people of Cologne were now free from the torments of the werewolf. The Holy Roman Empire's use of the breaking wheel had saved the day once again. But the wheel isn't unique to medieval Germany, not by a long shot, and there are countless instances of this punishment throughout time, so much so that many of you will have already heard of the breaking wheel under a different moniker, the Catherine wheel. The story goes that when St. Catherine of Alexandria refused to renounce her Christian faith in 4th century Egypt, she was subjected to execution via the wheel. However, upon touching the spools, the object of her intended torment immediately shattered, and so she was simply beheaded instead. As for the wheel itself, though, the earliest documented use that I've come across was a Roman version of the device that I found in Donnelly and Dale's Big Book of Pain, in which the authors describe a kind of A-frame to which a spiked wheel is attached. Then a victim is forced to lay on a bed of spikes on the floor, and the whole thing is placed on top of them. Then, with some enthusiastic turning of the wheel, the victim is slowly ground into sludge between the teeth of the wheel above and the bed of nails below. Then, of course, it had its applications as a torture method, where victims would be tied to the outside of the wheel, and then all manner of fire and other unpleasantness could be applied in order to draw a confession. But in reality, it lives on as a method of execution which includes torture, and not a typical tool of interrogation. One particularly grim case that is well recorded comes from 18th century Sweden, when a man named Johan Patkull suffered this grim fate after being charged with treason. His death was recorded by a priest named Lorenz Hagen, who witnessed the execution, and I'll give you his exact words. The executioner gave him the first stroke. His cries were terrible. "Oh, Jesus, Jesus, have mercy upon me." The cruel scene was much lengthened out and of the utmost horror, for as the headsman had no skill in his business, the wretch under his hands received upwards of 15 blows, each of which were intermixed with the most piteous groans and invocations of the name of God. At length, after 2 strokes given on the breast, his strength and voice failed him. In a faltering, dying tone, he was just heard to say, "Cut off my head." With the executioner still lingering, Patkull himself placed his head on the scaffold. In a word, after 4 strokes with a hatchet, the head was separated from the body, and the body quartered. Such was the end of the renowned Patkull. God have mercy on his soul. The wheel would also find its way to the Indian subcontinent when a group of Sikhs were executed this way in the 18th century after a series of back and forths between the Sikh community and their Islamic rulers. And it would also appear in the Americas, where it was used as a punishment for disobedient slaves, at least once in New York in 1712, and over multiple occasions during the 18th century in French Louisiana. Shockingly, despite how utterly brutal this form of punishment is, it remained one of the most enduring methods of inflicting cruelty, and the last known case of use was in 19th century Prussia, where a man named Rudolf Knapfel was put to death by the wheel on the 13th of August 1841, although some say that he was actually garroted or strangled to death just before the crushing began, allowing him to escape the agony whilst still retaining the symbolism of this form of execution. One way or another, though, I think it's pretty typical that we've managed to come up with such a sadistic twist on mankind's so-called greatest invention. It's October the 8th, 1594. We're on the banks of the Kamo River in Kyoto, Japan. Ishikawa Goemon, a bandit, outlaw, and to some folk hero, has had his last adventure. Now he is condemned to die, along with his sworn comrades, and even his young son. Ishikawa shivers, not because of the season. The last of the summer warmth still lingers in Kyoto, winter not yet on its way. Instead, he shudders because of what he sees before him. Vast cauldrons, each large enough to completely submerge a man, and all filled with boiling oil. His captors go through the motions. Goemon's sentence is read out, and he's hurled into the roiling, scalding oil. Along with him, Goemon's son is tossed into the pot. As the wicked agony of the oil overtakes him, Goemon's skin is slowed from his bones. Thrashing desperately in the vicious, cloying liquid, he makes one final attempt to save his son. Planting his feet firmly upon the burning hot base of the pot, he rises to his full height and lifts his son aloft, out of the oil. The story grows hazy here, years of popular myth and legend melding to create their own truth. Some say Goemon's final act of defiance affected his enemies, moving them to pardon the horrifically scolded, but still very much alive youngster. Others say Goemon's final act was a futile one. His strength fading, he sank back into the oil, taking his son with him. In either case, Goemon died that day on the banks of the Kamo River, in the most horrific of ways, and entered Japanese folklore as a result. Goemon's end is particularly evocative and astonishingly cruel, but it's not unique. It's a pattern we've seen time and time again in human history, the powers that be devising cruelly innovative ways to inflict suffering. For centuries, Japan's leaders made their own contributions to the catalogue of human misery, executing their prisoners in stomach-churning, sometimes stomach-lacerating ways. This is the story of capital punishment in feudal Japan. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Every day, you carry something that hasn't really changed in over a century. It's bulky, it's disorganized, it's easy to lose, and it's easy to steal. And that is your wallet. Exeter is here to change that with a sleek, secure wallet designed for the 21st century. Instead of stuffing cards into folds of leather, Exeter gives you instant access. Press a button and your cards pop up, neatly fanned and ready to use. It's fast, it's smooth, and honestly, it's kind of addictive. Made from premium materials, including aerospace-grade aluminium and substantially sourced leather, Exeter wallets are also RFID blocking, so your data stays safe. And if you lose the wallet, you're not going to have to spend 20 minutes lifting up every single pillow on the sofa, because you can just digitally locate the wallet in seconds. No more bulging pockets, no more digging for the right card, no more panic when you can't find your wallet. Currently, we're having a sale. You can get up to 44% off site-wide. Head to partner.exeter.com/flashbackhistory or click the link in the description and use the code FLASHBACK to unlock an extra 10% off at checkout. Don't carry the past in your pocket, carry Exeter. Feudal Japan is a broad term which covers a sprawling period. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo declared himself Tai Shogun, or barbarian quelling generalissimo, and began the era of the Kamakura shogunate. In 1868, Tokugawa Yoshinobu was overthrown, and the young Meiji Emperor was proclaimed ruler of Japan. Everything in between, almost 700 years, is feudal Japan, a period in which this group of islands on Asia's eastern boundaries was ruled over not by its emperor, but by a succession of warrior lords, or shogun. Traditionally, these shogun were leaders of samurai, an elite warrior class loyal to the code of Bushido, similar to medieval chivalric orders in Europe. The imperial family still existed, and the emperor still sat upon his throne in Kyoto, but the real power was held by the shogun, and secured by his samurai. There were periods of peace and stability, even unity over these centuries. There were even times when the emperor held power over his fractured, quarrelsome domain. But in the main, the nobility were in charge, usually the toughest guy with the biggest army. It was survival of the strongest, and so judicial violence, both corporal and capital punishment, was common in feudal Japan. A stark contrast to Japan's earlier imperial history. Before the rise of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, the death sentence was somewhat rare. During the Nara period, from 710 to 794, Buddhist teachings greatly influenced governance. In line with this message of peace and forgiveness, Nara Emperor Shomu is said to have ordered a stay on all executions. Later, during the Heian period, capital punishment was banned altogether. This made Japan the first territory in the known world to outlaw the death penalty. Such leniency, of course, would never last. In the final decades of the Heian period, the imperial government was feeling the pressure, and desperate to cling to power, they turned to the tried and tested brutal methods. After the failed Hogen insurrection in 1156, Emperor Go Shirakawa ordered that the rebel leader Minamoto no Tamayoshi be beheaded. The executioner, it was decreed, should be Tamayoshi's own son, Yoshitomo, who had remained loyal to the emperor. Yoshitomo refused. Another member of the Minamoto clan stepped in to do the deed, and with that, capital punishment returned to Japan. If this was meant to cement imperial power, it was only temporarily effective. 4 decades later, Tamayoshi's grandson, Yoritomo, was shogun. The imperial Heian period was over, and Japan was about to embrace capital punishment in a big way. This shift in judicial practice sort of makes sense, actually. In a world in which political assassination and armed coup d'etat are par for the course, leaders needed to secure their position. This meant making an example of anyone who might undermine that position or erode the rule of law. It's just that making an example tends to mean execution in the most hideous way possible. It's this doctrine of cruel, demonstrative punishment that brings us several hundred years later to the miserable demise of Ishikawa Goemon in a vat of boiling oil. Ishikawa is a little like a Japanese version of Robin Hood, and in more ways than one. Just like Mr. Robin Hood, Goemon has become something of a folk hero, an anti-authoritarian who stands up for the little guy, robbing the rich and giving to the poor. And, just like Robin Hood, there's a good chance that, in reality, he was simply a bandit looking to line his own pockets through violence and robbery. Either way, Goemon was accused of an attempted assassination on the daimyo, or feudal lord, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was captured and sentenced to death. A crime this grave required a punishment to match. Goemon's end would not be quick. As we all know, he would be boiled alive. We can barely imagine what Goemon experienced in his final moments on Earth. Plunging into the boiling liquid immediately results in blinding pain right across the body as the outer layers of the skin blister and fall away, exposing the nerves beneath. The extreme heat also cooks internal organs and tissues, essentially turning them to boiled meat while the victim is still alive. If the head is submerged, the brain will be boiled too, hastening death. But if, as the story goes, Goemon raised his son aloft in his pot, his head was most likely above the level of the oil. If the victim is lucky, or at least comparatively lucky, they may go into shock, shielding them from the worst of the pain. Again, though, it seems Goemon had the presence of mind to try and save his son, so he was likely fully aware of what was going on for a disturbingly long time. There's only so much punishment the body can take. Goemon's suffering would have been over in a matter of minutes at most, but those minutes would have felt like hours to a man literally being cooked alive. A horrific deterrent for sure. But, as Goemon wrote in a poem just before his execution, The grains of pure white sand may run out, but the seeds of thieves will never run out. In other words, kill as many bandits as you want. There'll always be more to take our place. The warning did not stop Japan's feudal lords. They really did try to kill as many bandits as possible, often through beheading with a sword or an axe. And not just bandits, an astonishing number of crimes could be punished this way in feudal Japan. A farmer who made a simple complaint to their lord might have their head chopped off. Document forgers, ship's captains who fraudulently claimed a lost load, even servant guarantors who failed to make sure their charges fulfilled a contract, all could meet the same fate. But a short, sharp chop wasn't the only way to remove a head. Oda Nobunaga, daimyo and de facto leader of Japan for a period in the 16th century, favoured the nokogeribiki method of capital punishment. In English, sawing. A pit would be dug deep enough for a man to stand in, the victim was placed inside, and the pit was filled in, pinning the victim within the earth. With his head now at ground level, his killers could lord their victory over him. This was, of course, humiliating enough, but it was nothing compared to the agony that would soon follow. A blade would then be drawn back and forth across the victim's neck, severing sinew, artery, and bone as their lifeblood pumped out onto the earth. So much blood loss would certainly be fatal, but nowhere near quickly enough. For much of the ordeal, the victim would still be alive and very probably conscious as the teeth of the saw worked its way through their neck. There are records of sawing taking place post-mortem too, a way for those in charge to make an example of their enemies with bodily mutilation and desecration, although I think we can all agree that these were the lucky ones. For more serious crimes, like a commoner convicted of murdering their master, sawing would be combined with other methods of punishment designed to maximise shame and prolong suffering. The condemned individual would first be paraded around the local area on horseback in a process known as hikimawashi. Then came sarashi, binding in chains and displaying to the public. Finally, sawing the wretched victim's head painfully and slowly removed from their shoulders. And then, in a final visible flourish, the body was crucified. Crucifixion was a way to ram home the message: murder your master, and this is what you get. But crucifixion wasn't only a way of displaying a dead body, it was also used on the still living. Take this tale from a battle between the Takeda and Okudaira clans in 1575. When Tori Sunimon slipped out of the Okudaira's clan castle late on September 22nd, he knew the risk of death was high. The castle was under siege, surrounded by Takeda forces. The Okudaira understood that their only hope was to summon help, to bring their friends in the legendary Tokugawa and Oda clans to their aid. The dangerous task of raising the alarm fell to Sunimon. Sunimon reached the clan's allies, but on attempting to re-enter the Okudaira fortress on September the 24th, he was spotted by the Takeda and taken prisoner. Fortunately, the Takeda were in a merciful mood. His life would be spared, they said, if he would tell his comrades inside the castle that the game was up and that no help would be coming. Sunimon agreed, but his captors were dismayed when he changed his message at the last minute. Instead of telling them they were all alone, he yelled to his comrades that help was on the way. All they needed to do was just hold out a little longer. The Takeda would not tolerate this kind of trickery. They took Sunimon and strapped him to a cross, tearing his flesh with spears known as yari, as he hung there exposed to the elements. Sunimon's body remained on its cross for 3 days, a grim demonstration of what happened to opponents of the Takedas. Sunimon's fate was brutal, but he likely knew what was coming to him. In a martial culture dominated by codes of honour and courage, Sunimon's subterfuge was never going to go down well. In the words of historian Petra Schmidt, crimes considered most despicable were punished by crucifixion. A person who had sneaked by a roadblock or assisted such a crime was crucified, as was one who let a foundling die. Plenty of other crimes were punished by crucifixion too, to quote Petra Schmidt again. An adulterous wife who killed her husband, false accusers of their own master or parents, forgers of gold or silver coins, all ended at the cross. This would have been a miserable experience. First, the accused underwent hikimawashi, so that all could revel in the shame and defeat. Next, they were hung up on the cross. The victims weren't nailed in place, like in the biblical tradition. Instead, they were tied and lofted above the execution site for all to see. Compounding the torture, the victims were jabbed from below with spears, drawing blood from gaping wounds in their sides. Finally, a spear would be jammed through the victim's throat, bringing the release of death. If the executioners were merciful, this final stroke would come quickly. Then the body would hang for 3 days, just like Senemon's did, a warning to anyone considering stepping out of line. Visibility was, as always, key. The medium was the message, a stark reminder of who was boss. Such was the eagerness to make a point that prisoners who died too quickly would be pickled so that they could be crucified later. Crucifixion would take different forms across Japan. Mizuharitsuki means water crucifixion. The victim was strung up on a cross on the shore at low tide, and as the water came in, it would submerge the victim up to their head as they struggled for breath against the rising tide. Victims didn't drown from this. The height of the cross was carefully calculated to extend the suffering. For several days and nights, victims were racked with hunger and thirst, the salt water driving them mad as it splashed against their parched lips. Their bodies burned in the sun and chilled in the rain until finally they expired. Sakasaritsuke meant crucifixion upside down. When he wasn't boiling bandits, daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi seemed to quite like this method, increasing the final agonies and delirium as blood pooled into the condemned's cranium. In the Christian tradition, upside-down crucifixion is associated with Saint Peter. Hideyoshi may have been aware of this. He may have just enjoyed the symbolism too, as quite a lot of Christians were crucified this way in an upside-down fashion. The most famous of all Japan's Christian crucifixions, however, was not conducted upside down. This was the killing of 26 people in Nagasaki in 1597. A Jesuit missionary said of the event, "The very pagans who assisted at the martyrdom was struck at seeing the joy of the blessed ones as they suffered on their crosses, and the courage with which they met death." It's unlikely that the missionary was actually present at the execution, given that he would have been a candidate for the cross himself, so we can't know quite how much joy those 26 wretched souls found in their final minutes. Other methods also reflect those used in Europe. Burning, for example, was the way many European heretics met their maker. Similar processes occurred in Japan, where victims were bound to a pillar above a pile of bamboo sticks, which were then set alight. Some methods were less common, but occasionally used. Ushizaki and kurumazaki meant being torn apart by either oxen or carts, exerting tremendous forces in opposite directions until the victim's body was ripped apart. While methods of execution were as diverse as the crimes of the accused, most shared some key aspects. They were designed to inflict maximum pain and maximum humiliation. But this led to a problem: the samurai. In Japan's far from equal society, samurai were considered a class above the regular peasantry. They could even mete out their own capital punishments. Kirisute Gomen, or the right to strike, meant samurai were permitted to cut the body of anyone they deemed to deserve it, typically leaving them to die, provided they followed strict rules in doing so. But though elite, samurai could still be sentenced to death. It wasn't the pain that was the issue for samurai. The chance to show resilience in the face of extreme suffering was actually welcomed under the Bushido Code. It was the humiliation, the loss of honour that was the problem. And to be killed by a lowly common executioner for a samurai was unacceptable. But this conundrum did have a solution. When writer Yukio Mishima and 4 associates visited the Ichigaya military camp in Tokyo, they had an agenda in mind. Taking the commander hostage, Mishima stepped onto a balcony to deliver his message to the soldiers amassed below him. "We have watched with gritted teeth as the shame of defeat has been ducked and avoided rather than wiped away, and as the Japanese themselves sully their own history and traditions." But this was not the 17th century, this was 1970. Mishima was not addressing a group of feudal samurai warriors, but instead the modern Japanese defense forces. Mishima's aim was a coup d'etat that would bring Japan back to its old ways, the traditional honour and valour which, in his view, had been lost. But the soldiers found Mashida's chiding insulting and annoying. They jeered him, forcing him back inside. What happened next was a bloody mess. The humiliated Mishima produced a sword and plunged it into his own abdomen, drawing it painfully across his stomach as blood and viscera poured from him onto the office floor. One of Mishima's accomplices, a man named Morita, acted as his second, or kaishakunin. Morita's job was to put an end to Mishima's misery by cutting off his head. Morita failed, and so a third man named Koga stepped in to finish the job. Morita now turned the blade on himself, tearing a great wound into his own stomach, spilling his intestines out onto a floor already awash with gore. Koga then stepped in again, cutting off his second head of the day and bringing the bizarre bloodshed to its conclusion. An arch-traditionalist, Mishima had ended his own life with seppuku, ritual suicide which allowed a samurai to regain lost honour, atone for certain crimes, or avoid disgrace following a defeat. The first recorded cases emerged in the 12th century when the practice was referred to as harakiri, or stomach cutting. It was not until the 15th century that the concept of seppuku first appeared, a formalised process of harakiri performed according to strict rules and customs. But seppuku wasn't just a method of suicide, it was also a form of capital punishment too, and for a samurai it was the only acceptable option. Perhaps the most famous example of this took place in 1703 when Samurai Oishi Yoshio and 46 others were sentenced to death for the assassination of the daimyo Kira Yoshinaka, avenging the killing of their own leader Asano Naganori 2 years earlier. They were instructed to honourably disembowel themselves, which 46 of them did on March 30th. The remaining man, Terasaka Kichiemon, received a pardon. Oishi and his comrades were samurai without a master, or ronin, and the story of the 47 ronin has resonated throughout Japanese history. However, forced seppuku was outlawed in 1873, but the practice has re-emerged several times in Japanese history since then. On the day of the Meiji Emperor's funeral in 1912, General Nogi Marisuke and his wife Shizuku ended their lives this way. In World War II, a number of defeated military commanders did the same. A study from the early 2000s found that 0.2% of suicide cases in Japan was still carried out in a manner similar to harakiri or seppuku. But brutal capital punishment is not unique to feudal Japan. In 1531, 6 decades before Ishikara Goemon met his hideous end, a man named Richard Roos was put to death in a very similar way by Henry VIII for the supposed crime of poisoning. Roos was repeatedly dipped into boiling liquid, prolonging his agony for 2 hours. I've actually done a video on this if you want to take a look once you're done with this one. And in 1757, on the Place de Grève in Paris, Robert François Damiens was executed in flagrant style for the attempted assassination on Louis XV. Damiens' genitals were cut off and his 4 limbs were tied to horses, which slowly and agonisingly dismembered him. His torso was then burned at the stake, and some accounts claim he was still alive as the flames claimed him. That, by the way, is the half of his execution. It just goes on and on and on. The grotesque display, in the end, was futile. Just as the execution of Minamoto no Tamayoshi in 1156 had not prevented the fall of the empire, the French monarchy was overthrown several decades later. The same executioner who had overseen Damiens' miserable end would go on to execute Louis' grandson, Louis XVI. Perhaps this endless cycle of violent power struggle troubled the Meiji Emperor after the restoration of the imperial power in 1868. 3 years later, he introduced a major reform to the penal code. Bizarre and elaborate methods of execution were outlawed, as was torture and flogging. Capital punishments became reserved for only the most serious of crimes. This was likely a smart move. For almost 700 years of feudal rule, Japanese justice had drawn on some of the most brutal methods imaginable. No one was in any doubt about what happened to those who stepped out of line. And yet, the rebellions, civil wars, and assassinations just kept coming. Violence, it seems, is not always a means to peace. Just like Gorman told us in his death poem, there will always be more bandits. There'll always be more people looking to overthrow tyrannical overlords. The Meiji Emperor was out to create a new Japan, more outward-facing, better equipped to deal with modern diplomacy and geopolitics, and this meant leaving the feudal era behind and reforming capital punishment. As to whether the Meiji Emperor actually succeeded in his aims to make Japan a benevolent, outward-looking and progressive state, that's definitely a story for another time. In the year 1605, a Jesuit priest named John Gerard finds himself under arrest in the Tower of London. It's suspected that he's been involved in a conspiracy to assassinate King James I in an event known to us as the Gunpowder Plot. The authorities want to know exactly what he's been up to, which means unless he gives them exactly what they want to hear, there's only one way this will end: with unspeakable torture. Within hours of his arrest, Gerard is fortunate enough to be shown first-hand and up close exactly which devices will be used on him. He would then go on to recount that we went to the torture room in a kind of solemn procession, the guards walking ahead with lighted candles. It was a vast and shadowy place, and every device and instrument of human torture was there. They pointed out some of them to me, and said that I would have a taste of them. Then they asked me again if I would confess. See, typically there are two reasons to torture someone. The first reason is as part of a punishment, where the execution method is designed to be part death sentence, part torture, in order to set an example and send a message to others observing. These include punishments such as being sawn in half, flayed alive, or smashed to pieces on the breaking wheel. But the second reason, and one we often overlook, is that torture was often used as a means of extracting information, which means that today we'll be looking at many of the non-lethal methods of torture that were used during this time. But make no mistake, when taken to their extremes, these ghastly tools could be just as deadly as any other method. If we go back to the priest Gerard, he was shown a number of these tools, up close and personal, before being asked if he would like to confess. So, what did he see? And more gruesomely, what was he forced to endure? Oftentimes, torture would begin with the lighter methods and then proceed to more extreme measures. First up would often be the thumbscrew. This device is as simple as it is utterly excruciating. It consisted of 3 metal poles, the centre one being threaded, and then a metal bar was placed along these poles horizontally, so that as the wing nut was turned, the metal bar would press into the base of the vice with unbelievable force. The victim would then have their thumb inserted into the contraption, and then by tightening the clamp, the thumbs would be squeezed incrementally, as the torture master issued question after question to the victim. Give them what they want to hear, and the vice would be loosened. Fail to cooperate, and the wing nut gets tightened, until the iron bars are pressed into the thumbs and begin to crush the digits inside with sickening efficiency. In order to speed the torture up, sometimes the bars were studded with small spikes in order to crush the nail beneath, or the vice can be adjusted so that instead of applying pressure to the tip of the thumbs, you can crush at the middle knuckle. With enough pressure, this would utterly obliterate the thumbs inside, causing audible cracks, popping as the ends of the thumbs are ejected from their sockets, and of course, irreparable damage to the victim's hands. In 1596, the son of a suspected witch was subjected to the torture in order to extract a confession against his mother, and he managed to endure an incredible 57 turns of the vice before they finally relented, at which point his younger sister, just 7 years old, was subjected to that same cruelty. Other variations have been adapted to allow for the crushing of the big toes, or devices such as pillywicks, which are more or less the exact same thing, except they would crush all the fingers of the hand rather than just the thumbs alone. It's worth noting, though, that this method of torture isn't unique to medieval Europe, and other variations existed in India, where instead of the thumbscrew device, victims would have the fingers of their hands bound tightly together with cord, and then wedges of bamboo were smashed between the tightly bound fingers, slicing through flesh, tendon and bone, crushing the knuckles, and eventually breaking the fingers themselves. It was, of course, a device of unimaginable brutality, and likewise, the pain must have been beyond comprehension. Unfortunately, however, we're just getting started. Next up would be the rack. Now, we've covered the rack on this channel before, so I'll try and keep it brief, but like the thumbscrews, the idea is relatively simple. However, instead of subjecting a small part of the body to crushing, the rack works by subjecting almost all of the body to agony by pulling. The victim is forced to lie on their back before each of their limbs are tied to a separate rope, at which point they're all attached to a pulley system. Then, like the screws, pressure is gradually added until the victim decides to speak. As the process began, they would experience mild pain, which would quickly become unbearable as muscles and tendons begin to strain under pressure. This would then escalate beyond imagining as these same muscles and tendons begin to tear away from one another inside the body. Eventually, the victim would begin to realise that should the rack be tightened any further, the damage would be permanent, as joints become dislocated with a sickening crack and pop that would echo through the chamber. Taken even further, the limbs could be completely torn from their sockets, essentially dismembering the victim by tearing the arms and legs away from their torso, one methodical crank at a time. Guy Fawkes, one of the key conspirators behind the gunpowder plot, managed to last 3 days on the rack before finally spilling the beans, and the consequences of this brutal torment can be seen on his signature. Before the torture, it's relatively clear, but after, you can barely make out a squiggle because his arms, wrists and hands had been completely obliterated under the strain. The rack was actually so deeply feared by people of the time that there are some impressive tales of people who resorted to any measure possible in order to avoid being subjected to this cruel fate. In April 1628, a man named John Felton was arrested after stabbing the Duke of Buckingham to death. It was ordered that he be interrogated to see who else was involved in the murder plot. The responsibility of putting Felton under this questioning fell to the Earl of Dorset. After a series of unsuccessful interrogation sessions, the Earl of Dorset grew frustrated and finally threatened John Felton with the rack if he refused to comply. What happens next is only a testament to the incredible courage that Felton was able to muster. He turned to the Earl of Dorset and told him that, "If I be put on the rack, I will accuse you, my Lord Dorset, and no one else but you, as my only accomplice." This put Dorset in an impossible position because at the time, confessions given under torture were accepted as absolute truth, and if Dorset was accused of this crime, he would quickly find himself in the exact same position as Felton was. This clever trick managed to save Felton a stint on the rack, but he was still hanged on the 28th of November, 1628. Another tale comes to us from 16th century Bohemia when a baron named Scanor was arrested on suspicion of heresy, and during his arrest he was told that if he didn't willingly give up the name of his fellow heretics, then the next day he would be racked until he decided to talk. When the guards came to Scanor's cell the next morning in order to escort him to the rack, they found that the man had cut out his own tongue and had left a note next to him reading, "I did this extraordinary act because I would not, by any means or any tortures, be brought to accuse myself or others, as I might, through the excruciating torments of the rack, be impelled to utter falsehoods." Despite being an incredible act of will, Scanor would not escape the rack, and his executioners decided that since he had forfeited his right to speak, he should instead simply be racked to death. The only consolation is that he was, of course, unable to implicate anyone else in the supposed crime of disagreeing with the authorities on religious matters. If you remember, this video started with us talking about Father John Gerard, the Jesuit priest who was arrested under suspected involvement in the gunpowder plot, and then he was marched around the torture chambers within the Tower of London in order to scare him into an early confession. This did not work, and he refused to comply, at which point he was also subjected to the rack. However, unlike the other unfortunate individuals we've mentioned so far, Father Gerard was able to survive his experiences and eventually escaped to the European continent, where he was relatively safe. But the torture itself would, of course, continue. Next up, we have pincers and shears. Now, these, of course, are not items that are used only for torturing, but with a few modifications and a little creativity, they can be put to inhuman use. Shears, of course, were used to cut and were put to that same use inside the chambers. Victims would have a finger, a toe, a nose, an ear, anything that would fit inside the shears, basically, placed between those blades and questioned. Those who refused to provide answers would find themselves a few inches less than they were before the process began. Pincers were used in much the same way, pinching little gobs of flesh between being twisted and pulled in a sharp yanking motion in order to tear away chunks of the victim. These were also sometimes heated until red hot in order to add the pain of burning into the whole equation. Victims could, of course, stop the whole affair by confessing to their crime or implicating others, at which point the torture masters would stop picking them apart. Another very popular way of extracting confessions was honestly less of a device and more of a method, but it's so prevalent that we do need to cover it, and that was crushing. The process began by having a victim lay on a small ball or obstruction under the small of their back, and then having a large wooden board placed over their body. Then, gradually, weights would be added to the board until the victim underneath was slowly crushed. In the outset, this would of course have made breathing difficult, and it would have been painful, but as the weight increases over and over, the victim would have to decide if they were willing to risk being asphyxiated or having their spine crushed between the heavy weight above and the ball underneath the small of their back. And they know that they could make this all go away if they just spilled the beans. In some cases, up to 400 kilograms were added to the board, and the results were predictable. Broken ribs, crushed organs, irreparable spinal damage and disfigurement were all part and parcel of the process, especially for those who decided to talk too late, and especially for those who had the stones to not talk at all. This method of torture was extremely popular during the medieval and early modern period because it was relatively slow, easy to control, and ultimately performed an important legal function. See, at the time, a trial couldn't begin until the accused entered into a plea of guilty or not guilty. Lots of people tried to abuse this loophole by refusing to enter a plea, since if they entered the trial and then they were found guilty, not only would they be punished, but all of their lands and assets would also become forfeit, and so many were willing to endure this torture in order to make sure that they spared their family the fate of destitution. One notable victim of crushing was Lady Margaret Clitheroe, who suffered this fate in 1586. Clitheroe was under suspicion of illegally harbouring some Catholic priests, and at the time this was a very serious crime, and so the court needed her to make a plea, which she, predictably, refused to do. This meant that torture became the only method of moving ahead with the trial. The problem was that no professional torture hand wanted a part in the torture of a lady, and so the court was forced to find someone else to do the job. They found a bunch of homeless beggars and paid them an obscene ransom if they would crush Lady Clitheroe until she entered a plea. Being homeless, they accepted, but the whole affair turned into a bit of a shit show. The beggars broke into her house, ripped off her front door to use as the board, forced her to lay on her front, not her back, and then started adding weights to the board across her back. She didn't even have time to consider confessing before these knuckleheads had added too much weight and killed her on the spot, alongside her unborn child. So yes, torture can be used as a method to get people talk, but oftentimes what they say won't be true, and obviously, if you do it wrong, they can't say anything at all. So, it's best avoided.